Chapter 1 began with the MC believing that everything had gone exactly as she had planned. She was meant to live in a castle where luxury knew no bounds, bearing the title of crown princess of a vast empire that ruled the continent. Every aspect of the world existed for her, and everything belonged to her. That was how it was supposed to be. Everything changed when the crown prince called Karina Amandia Crocus forward and declared their engagement over. He denounced her as a wretched soul who envied her sister's true love, trampled others beneath her, indulged in luxury, and acted only for her own selfish desires. As punishment, he ordered her to cool her foolish head in the northern lands, where the beasts dwelled. In Chloria, during the year 490 of the royal era, Karina Amandia Crocus, who had been destined to become the wife of the first prince of the kingdom of Chloria, was instead exiled to the frigid wastelands. Snow fell over Karina's castle in the northern lands. Inside, her maid informed her that her meal was ready. Karina dismissed it as nothing more than scrap. When she turned toward the maid, the woman looked confused, prompting Karina to state that she was not hungry and that the meal should simply be taken away. Karina gazed upon the trees that had shed their leaves and stood in miserable silence beneath the snow. The frigid land, where the cold air seemed to freeze her from her fingertips, lay buried beneath a white expanse that swallowed even the faintest light. She sighed as she wondered how everything had turned out this way. Her thoughts returned to the kingdom of Chloria, the most powerful and wealthiest nation on the continent, with vast territories stretching east, west, south, and north. Several years earlier, she had been welcomed into the royal family as the fiancée of the first Prince Orlando, and she had devoted herself to maintaining the dignified conduct expected of a future queen. She had cultivated the commanding presence required of someone in power, nurtured relationships with royalty and nobility from other nations, and pursued the beauty worthy of a queen. Yet despite all of that, the first prince had unexpectedly cast her aside. Karina believed he had been foolishly deceived by flattering words. As she bit her nails, her thoughts settled on the woman she loathed above all else. Karina remarked to her maid, Seal, that she must have drawn the short straw by ending up with a master like her in such a distant place, believing she was surely tired of it. Seal remained steadfast in her duty to serve Lady Karina. Karina scoffed at Seal's stubbornness before turning toward the window. She resolved that she would return to the top. Orlando, who had driven her to this place, and her younger sister, Aurora, who had influenced him, would both face her revenge. Seal attempted to calm her, but a sudden loud rumble interrupted them. As the snow continued to fall outside, Karina and Seal stood ready inside the castle while the walls and furniture creaked around them. They waited several seconds until the rumbling finally stopped. Seal then wondered what the sound had been. Karina recalled that the foolish prince had mentioned the northern lands as the place where beasts dwelled. When Seal questioned what she meant, Karina remembered reading about them in an old book. They were described as terrifying creatures that had remained unchanged since the age of legend, bearing sharp fangs, powerful claws, and grotesque forms beyond belief. As night fell, they were said to strike from the darkness, toying with their victims before mercilessly taking their lives. Karina also remembered hearing that, after the Great War, they had been banished to the northern lands. Even so, she dismissed the story as nothing more than a tale meant to frighten children into going to bed. Seeing Karina put on her coat, Seal realized she intended to go outside. Karina decided to investigate the source of the rumble, planning to grab a sandwich first. If it had been an avalanche and the damage reached the castle, the consequences could be severe. Seal immediately tried to accompany her, but Karina cut her off, questioning what use she would be and ordering her not to follow. She then slammed the door shut behind her. Outside, snow continued to fall steadily as Karina walked through the northern lands. Looking around once more, she saw nothing but a barren landscape. She questioned how she could have spoken so confidently of revenge when all she had left were a handful of servants and an endless stretch of white land reaching as far as the eye could see. Holding onto a tree, Karina surveyed the area and concluded that it truly had been an avalanche. She felt relieved that it had not reached the castle. In the distance, however, she noticed something lying in the snow. At first she wondered if it was a puppy, then considered that it might be a wolf. The snow crunched beneath her feet as she approached the sleeping animal. She regarded it as another nuisance, thinking that after an avalanche struck her lands, she now had pests to deal with as well. Even if it was only a young wolf, she believed she needed to eliminate it before it caused trouble. Karina drew her sword and pointed it at the shivering wolf. At that moment, a memory from her childhood resurfaced. When she and Aurora were still young, their parents had called both sisters over. Their father showed them a white stuffed dog that their uncle had kindly brought as a present and told Karina to thank him. Delighted, Karina promised that she would take good care of it. Their mother then noticed Aurora quietly watching Karina play with the toy while smiling. She asked Karina, as the older sister, if she could let Aurora have it instead. Karina remembered hesitating and hugging the toy tightly, but her father quickly offered her an embroidery kit instead, explaining that she was old enough to begin learning. Her mother agreed, and her father added that it was more suitable for her since she would be getting married someday. Looking down, Karina reluctantly accepted and handed the stuffed dog to Aurora. Aurora asked if she was certain before quickly thanking her and promising to treasure it. Karina then watched as Aurora coughed again, and their mother reminded Aurora that getting too excited would cause her fever to return. Back in the present, Karina admitted to herself that she had wanted it as well. She sheathed her sword and knelt before the wolf. Offering it her sandwich, she urged it to eat. Although she had already eaten some of it, the little wolf slowly approached the sandwich. The scent immediately brightened its eyes, and as it began eating, Karina silently thanked Seal. After a few moments, the wolf stopped eating and simply stared at Karina. She wondered why it was looking at her face and questioned whether something was on it. Without warning, the wolf dashed away. Karina called after it, then stood and followed its track. As she did, she complained to herself about how quickly it had left and how heartless it was. Eventually, she stopped, groaned, and decided to forget about it. She resolved to take a look at the town instead. Karina's eyes widened as an arrow shot past her face. She turned at once to see what was behind her before dropping low. She wondered who had fired it, but before she could finish the thought, another arrow landed nearby. Convinced they had mistaken her for a poacher, she believed they were deliberately targeting her. She even wondered if they were aiming at her because they knew she was Karina Amandia Crocus. Another arrow flew toward her and struck her in the chest. Falling to her knees, she concluded that they were merely pawns of the prince and her sister. She forced herself to run, believing that exile alone had not satisfied them and that they had even sent assassins to such a remote place. Before long, her legs gave out, and she collapsed face-first into the snow before rolling onto her back. Opening her eyes, she saw that a blizzard had begun. She scoffed at the weather turning against her, and thought that her life truly was the worst. She believed she was always the one who drew the short straw. Her thoughts drifted to the white stuffed dog toy she had once given Aurora, and she admitted to herself that she had honestly wanted to treasure it as well. A long-haired figure suddenly appeared before Karina, with only their back visible to her. As she struggled to focus on the person's face, her strength gradually faded, and everything went black. Some time later, Karina slowly stirred awake. As she opened her eyes, she realized it was warm. Rising from the bed, she looked around the unfamiliar room and wondered where she was. She remembered being in the snowy mountains, but before she could think further, a voice announced that she was awake. In the next instant, she was pulled back onto the bed, causing her to cry out in surprise. Standing before her was a wolf woman who greeted her as her darling princess. Karina stared at the unfamiliar woman in disbelief, before looking down at herself and realizing she was naked. The wolf woman calmly remarked that making such a fuss immediately after waking was proof that Karina was healthy. She explained that she had removed Karina's clothes because leaving them on would have caused her to freeze to death. She further assured Karina that she had done nothing improper, stating that she was not foolish enough to lay hands on her betrothed before their wedding. Startled, Karina demanded an explanation after hearing herself referred to as the woman's fiancé. She insisted that she did not even know who the woman was and had no memory of becoming engaged to anyone. Then she noticed the animal-like ears atop the woman's head and realized they were wolf ears. The wolf woman asked whether Karina had not yet realized the truth. She reminded her that, in the snowy mountains, when she had been starving, Karina had given her the prey she had bitten into. Karina recalled feeding a little wolf her sandwich and realized what the woman meant. Seeing the recognition on her face, the wolf woman remarked that it seemed Karina had finally remembered her. Karina explained that giving the sandwich had not really been her intention. Even so, the wolf woman pointed out that, in the snowy mountains, offering her own food to a starving wolf that could have attacked her was not something an ordinary person would do. Most people would have simply killed a weakened but dangerous animal instead. She reminded Karina that she had initially raised her sword against her and asked why she had not gone through with it. Karina looked away and admitted that it was because she had been reminded of that little girl. The wolf woman smiled and gently caressed Karina's face. She told her that Karina was someone who could cherish and care for others and that she truly possessed a beautiful heart. Karina questioned the remark to herself as the wolf woman began rubbing her ear, leaving her bewildered. Before she could react further, the wolf woman suddenly bit her neck, piercing her skin and drawing blood. She then declared that she, Rishutoka, daughter of the wolf tribe, had performed the tribe's traditional marriage rite and vowed to become Karina's faithful partner. Karina was left stunned by the declaration. Rishutoka then asked Karina to tell her name, addressing her as her darling princess. In Chloria, during the year 491 of the royal era, the noblewoman Karina Amandia Crocus, who had been exiled from the royal capital, unexpectedly encountered Rishutoka, the daughter of the wolf tribe. As Rishutoka pushed Karina onto the bed, leaving her in utter confusion over what was happening, the traditional marriage rite had already been completed. Without understanding how it had happened, Rishutoka ended up becoming Karina's fiancé. As the snow raged outside, Rishutoka's house remained quiet within. Rishutoka hovered over Karina after performing the wolf tribe's traditional marriage rite and declared herself Karina's faithful partner. Karina could only wonder who the girl before her was. Chapter 2.1 began immediately afterward. Karina remained silent, leading Rishutoka to believe she had been startled. Interpreting the silence as submissiveness, Rishutoka touched Karina's lips and found the reaction adorable. Karina abruptly shoved Rishutoka away, sat upright, and protested that Rishutoka could not decide everything on her own. She refused to accept being called her partner. Rishutoka expressed surprise that Karina had not listened. She introduced herself as Rishutoka, daughter of the wolf tribe that dwelled in the northern lands, adding that there was no need to address her with formal titles because she was now Karina's protector. Karina was taken aback by the mention of a tribe living in the northern lands, a place said to be impossible for any living being to survive. When Rishutoka asked for her name, Karina refused to reveal it to someone she regarded as her kidnapper. Rishutoka laughed at Karina's defiance, admiring her strong sense of pride. Deciding that names were not especially important to her people, she chose to call Karina Princess instead. Believing the introductions were complete, she moved on, while Karina objected that no proper introductions had taken place and that Rishutoka was once again acting entirely on her own. Without warning, Rishutoka grabbed Karina, pushed her onto the bed, and attempted to continue what she considered their marriage vow. Karina struggled in protest, but Rishutoka assured herself that Karina could endure the pain before leaning down and biting her neck. As blood dripped from the wound, Rishutoka drank it. Karina realized that what Rishutoka called a marriage vow resembled feeding far more than any vow. Clutching her neck in pain, she heard Rishutoka apologize while remarking that Karina was so docile that she might accidentally kill her if she was not careful. Karina remembered the stories describing beasts with sharp fangs, powerful claws, grotesque forms beyond belief, and a habit of toying with their victims in the darkness before mercilessly taking their lives. She realized those tales had not been lies. Watching Rishutoka grin and reveal her sharp teeth, Karina shivered. After a few moments, Rishutoka licked the wound on Karina's neck as Karina tried to object. Before Rishutoka could bite her again, a voice called out to her. Both of them turned toward the entrance of the tent, where two wolf men stood. They informed Rishutoka that the cargo had arrived at the village entrance and that they needed her assistance. Frustrated that the interruption had come just as she believed things were becoming interesting, Rishutoka reluctantly accepted. She apologized to Karina, asked her to wait, kissed her forehead, and left the tent. Karina slowly sat up, relieved that she had been saved. She placed a hand over the stinging wound on her neck and found it stained with blood. Narrowing her eyes, she scoffed. She could not understand what Rishutoka had meant by calling her a partner, believing that no one should treat someone they loved that way. A few moments later, Karina cautiously peeked outside the tent. Realizing it was a village of beasts and that there were others outside, she decided it would be best to escape as quickly as possible. She turned back into the tent and began making preparations. Although Rishutoka had spoken about partners and marriage, Karina believed the girl had only intended to use her as food. After all, the stories claimed that beasts toyed with people in the darkness. Karina suddenly paused as Rishutoka's words about pride being another kind of beauty resurfaced in her mind. Looking down at her clothes, she remembered the many things people had said about her throughout her life. Her mother and father had described her as having a straightforward personality. One man had criticized her arrogance and claimed she should learn to be more charming. The women of her court had whispered that Lady Karina was stubborn and difficult to deal with. Everyone had always compared her unfavorably to her younger sister, Aurora. Grabbing her cape, Karina approached the entrance of the tent. She scoffed, stepped outside, glanced around to ensure the way was clear, and then dashed away. As Karina fled, Rishutoka's ears suddenly twitched as though sensing something. One of the wolf men continued speaking about the book, before calling out to her. Rishutoka turned back toward him, apologized for losing focus, and walked over to the wolf men. Even so, her thoughts lingered on the princess. Meanwhile, as the blizzard continued to rage, Karina struggled to catch her breath somewhere in the snowy wilderness. Just after escaping the wolf tribe, Karina trudged through the snow. She noted that Rishutoka did not appear to be following her. Karina had expected to find her way home once she reached an open area, but no matter how far she traveled, the endless forest continued. Without warning, her foot sank into the snow. She lost her footing, screamed, and tumbled down the mountainside. Cursing under her breath, Karina realized her legs would not obey her. Dragging herself beneath a tree, she reflected that she had nearly died the previous day, and there was no way her strength could have returned in only a single day. Orlando's words echoed in her mind as he had ordered her to cool her foolish head in the northern lands where the beasts dwelled. She bitterly wondered if this was what he had meant by cooling down. She also questioned why that beast had saved her. If she had truly been meant as food, there had been no reason for Rishutoka to wait instead of letting her freeze to death. Karina eventually collapsed beneath the tree, her eyes fixed sadly on the falling snow. She wondered if this was truly how she would die, completely alone. Covering her face, her expression soon hardened with resolve. She angrily demanded to know whose fault it was that she had ended up alone as her hand clenched into a fist. Her thoughts were interrupted by someone calling out to the princess. Looking into the distance, Karina spotted a figure repeatedly shouting for her. A few moments later, Rishitoka reached her. She questioned what Karina had been thinking, reminding her that she had not yet fully recovered and asking why she had gone outside. Rishitoka admitted she was relieved to have found her by following her scent. Karina asked if Rishitoka had really come all that way just to search for her. Rejecting that thought, she instead wondered if humans were truly so delicious that Rishitoka would go to such lengths to find one. Rishitoka found the question strange. Noticing Karina's confusion, she guessed that Karina had been trying to return to her hometown and warned her that a cliff lay ahead, making the route dangerous. She urged Karina to return to the village for the time being before checking whether she had been injured and asking if she could still stand. As Rishitoka helped pull her up, Karina initially resisted. Rishitoka remarked that freezing in the snow was painful, and seeing the sincerity in her concern, Karina hesitated before wondering if she truly meant it. Suddenly, Rishitoka's ears twitched. She immediately threw herself onto Karina, knocking her aside to avoid an incoming arrow. After apologizing, Rishitoka remarked that it no longer seemed to be the time for a leisurely conversation. In the distance, 3 masked men stood with their weapons drawn. Karina suspected they were connected to the previous day's events and concluded they were the prince's and Aurora's subordinates. Rishitoka stepped forward and declared that the meeting between the 2 lovers was precious and should not be interrupted. In response, the masked men reloaded their weapons and aimed them at Karina. Rishitoka regarded them as heartless people. Karina warned Rishitoka to be careful, explaining that the men were skilled assassins and that they needed to create an opening to escape. Rishitoka questioned why that would be necessary. Karina insisted that anyone who had pursued her all the way to such a place was no ordinary thug, and that fighting them head-on would leave them injured. Rishitoka realized these were the same people they had encountered the previous day and concluded that merely driving them away had not been enough. Understanding that they were targeting her partner, she stepped forward. Karina reflected on Rishitoka's words. If she had only chased the attackers away instead of fleeing with Karina, then perhaps Rishitoka truly was that strong. Advancing toward the assassins, Rishitoka remarked that although she would have enjoyed playing with them, her princess was cold and freezing, leaving her no time for such distractions. As the men trained their crossbows on her, Rishitoka laughed and declared that it was a good partner's duty to protect her princess before asking them to step aside. In the next instant, one of the men was startled as Rishitoka appeared beside him, only to be sent flying by her attack. Another assassin cursed, aimed his crossbow at Karina, and fired. Rishitoka immediately rushed to Karina, grabbed her, and leaped far away from the remaining attackers. Telling Karina to hold on tightly, she jumped off a cliff before Karina could react. As the assassins watched them fall, Rishitoka shouted for them to look behind themselves. She drew in a deep breath and unleashed a roar that triggered an avalanche, burying the men beneath the crashing snow. Karina watched as Rishitoka smiled at the outcome. After escaping, Rishitoka gently set Karina down and assured her that she was safe. Although Karina had described the assassins as strong, Rishitoka considered them unimpressive, remarking that nature had made them appear weak. Karina could only ask if Rishitoka herself was truly that powerful, finding it incredible. Rishitoka proudly affirmed that she was a member of the wolf tribe and that there was no possibility of losing to an ordinary human. She further declared that, even among her own people, she was by far the strongest. Karina considered that the 3 men had likely been assassins sent by the first prince, yet Rishitoka had defeated those trained veterans with ease. She recalled the stories describing beasts with sharp fangs, powerful claws, and grotesque forms beyond belief, and realized that the legendary beasts were undoubtedly the wolf tribe. If she could gain such power as her ally, everything would change. Rishitoka then urged Karina to hurry before darkness fell. Extending her hand, she invited Karina to return to the village together. Karina decided that, even if she was somehow being deceived, she no longer cared. If she could bring the wolf tribe to her side, taking revenge would become effortless. That foolish prince and her wretched sister would never expect her to return with an army of beasts, and she eagerly imagined the expressions on their faces when they saw her again. After accepting Rishitoka's hand and standing, Karina apologized for her earlier rudeness and thanked her for the help. She finally introduced herself as Karina and entrusted herself to Rishitoka's care from that moment onward. Rishitoka blushed at Karina's smile, finding her even more adorable, and happily shook her hand while promising to take care of her as well. Karina's expression grew resolute as she silently vowed that the entire kingdom would witness her return. With the strength of the beast tribe at her side, she would have her revenge and reclaim everything her sister had taken from her. Chapter 3 began in the past as Karina remembered the moment after a carriage had departed. Back when she was still little, she had asked her father and mother about what they had just said. Her mother continued by explaining that Karina would become Prince Orlando's betrothed in Aurora's place. Confused, Karina wondered if they could explain why. Her mother asked her not to resent Aurora, explaining that her sister's body was too weak to avoid becoming entangled in the royal family's succession disputes. His Majesty the King had asked the Crocus family to provide a bride. Although Prince Orlando had requested Aurora, sending her in her frail condition to such a place would have been dangerous. Karina wondered whether it was truly acceptable for her to take Aurora's place. After a brief silence, her father called her name. Karina clenched her hands before quietly accepting that she would become the prince's fiancée. Her mother assured her that everything would be fine. She told Karina that she was a dependable girl and would become a great queen. As her mother gently caressed her face, Karina could only wonder what she meant by saying everything would be fine and that she was dependable. If that was the case, then she would try to become like Aurora, someone who needed to be cared for. She wondered if things would have been better had she simply acted like her sister. Karina suddenly jolted awake and caught her breath, reassuring herself that it had only been a bad dream. Still recovering from it, she noticed Rishitoka beside her, hugging her tightly. A few moments later, Rishitoka repeatedly apologized, admitting that she had been craving some human warmth, or rather, Karina's warmth, and adding that it had been cold outside. Karina reminded her that although she had agreed to let Rishitoka take care of her from now on, she had never given her permission to climb into bed with her. Rishitoka apologized again before nervously wondering whether her princess was angry with her. In response, Karina silently recalled her vow that she would reclaim everything her sister had taken from her. 2 days had passed since then, and because of the heavy snowfall, she had ultimately been unable to return home. For the time being, she would remain in the beast village. Karina glanced at Rishitoka, who was happily eating. She reminded herself that Rishitoka was the daughter of the beast tribe. To be honest, she could not trust her. No matter how friendly Rishitoka appeared, her true nature was still that of a man-eating beast. Until she could achieve her revenge, Karina needed to remain cautious and avoid having her throat slit while she slept. However, the immediate issue was the food. Looking down at the variety of dishes before her, she swallowed hard at the sight. When Rishitoka noticed, she wondered whether Karina was hungry. Karina denied it, but inwardly she realized that their lifestyles were completely incompatible. The greatest difference was their food, as there seemed to be no concept of cooking. The fish and animal meat were served raw, while the only side dish consisted of nuts. Karina had expected something like this to some extent, but the beast's way of life was completely different from that of humans. She picked up one of the nuts, wondering if it was a walnut, and as she attempted to eat it, she glanced at Rishitoka, who continued slurping and tearing apart the raw meat with her teeth. Karina watched as Rishitoka finished her meal and decided that she needed to try adjusting, even if only a little. After a while, she asked whether there were any books about the village's history. When Rishitoka looked confused, Karina explained that it felt disrespectful not to know anything about the wolf tribe, so if such books existed, she would like to read them. Rishitoka replied that there were none. Startled, Karina wondered if there were at least books that described the village, even if they were not history books. Rishitoka did not think so. Karina found it hard to believe there was not even a single one. Rishitoka then explained that the wolf tribe had no written language, so they did not record their history. Everything essential for life was passed down orally. Karina was taken aback by the revelation that they had no written language. She had hoped to search through books unavailable in the central regions to gather information that would give her an advantage over the beasts. Rishitoka then realized that Karina used written language. Karina confirmed that important things should be written down and preserved. After thinking for a moment, Rishitoka suddenly remembered something and said there was somewhere she wanted to take Karina after they finished eating. Karina was left confused. After finishing their meal, they left Rishitoka's tent and walked to another tent. Karina wondered whether it was a bookstore or a library, then remembered that Rishitoka had said there were no books in the village. Rishitoka loudly called out to ask whether the owner was there as she opened the tent flap, prompting Karina to think she was being far too loud. Another wolf woman emerged from inside and asked what was going on, wondering why Rishitoka was not out hunting that day. Rishitoka explained that, starting today, she would be showing the princess around the village because keeping her cooped up inside the house was too restrictive. Karina watched as the two wolf women greeted each other by biting each other in the face. A few moments later, the wolf woman asked if Karina was the princess. Karina confirmed it. The wolf woman smiled upon realizing she was Karina and remarked that it was no wonder she was engaged to Rishitoka, as she was a young lady full of vitality. Rishitoka readily agreed. Karina wondered why she had been brought there and looked toward the mountain of books stacked inside. The wolf woman explained that this was where she handled translation work. Curious, Karina considered what she meant by translation. The wolf woman admitted that, although it was a little embarrassing, the village had also been affected by changing times and could no longer remain completely self-sufficient. They had begun interacting with nearby human settlements, trading food, clothing, and other goods. To make that possible, they translated the human language into the wolf tribe's language and the wolf tribe's language into the humans. Karina understood that this was the purpose of the place. The wolf woman happily confirmed it before explaining that they had encountered a problem. Although the wolf tribe could quickly learn to speak human languages, they could not seem to learn human writing. She guessed it was a disadvantage of not having a written language of their own. Karina agreed, realizing that she had been able to communicate with everyone in the village without any difficulty since arriving. The wolf woman nodded and explained that there should be no language barrier for Karina there because everyone could speak. Even so, deciphering human books and letters still took a great deal of time. Rishitoka then got to the main point by asking whether Karina could read the books aloud and tell them their contents verbally. Karina was left stunned. Rishitoka explained that Karina did not have to translate everything. She could simply work on the books that interested her, and in return, Rishitoka promised to thank her properly. Karina glanced at the books and considered refusing. However, if she wanted to make the beasts her allies, it would be better to treat them with kindness as well. Accepting one of the books, she reminded herself that this arrangement would only last until the snowfall receded and she could leave the village. She agreed to help a little. The wolf woman reacted with delight, and when Karina asked if she could use a seat nearby, the wolf woman readily told her to use it however she liked. Karina sat down, opened the book, and quietly scanned its pages, noticing the beautiful illustrations. As Rishitoka leaned over beside her and wondered what she had found, Karina, slightly startled, realized that the book was a fairy tale. Rishitoka wondered if it was the same as a legend. Karina explained that they were slightly different and that fairy tales were old picture books written in old-fashioned language, mainly intended for children. Understanding, Rishitoka became curious about the story and asked Karina to read it. After a brief pause, Karina began reading. The story told of a child blessed by the spirits, born in a world of gifted life, who grew into a beautiful princess in a land of snow glittering like a sea of gems beneath the starlit night sky. Cherished by everyone as she was raised in the palace, the princess eventually became the target of monsters who sought to claim her beauty for themselves. Just as the tale reached the words describing one day, a sudden rustling sound interrupted her. Karina and Rishitoka turned toward the entrance and saw 3 children standing there. Rishitoka called out to the children, reminding them that they could not simply barge inside, before introducing Karina as the princess to the village children. She then asked what had brought them there. The first child excitedly asked for stories, the second wondered whether Karina had been reading a story and if it was exciting, while the third asked who she was. Realizing that the story had captured their interest, Rishitoka watched as the children excitedly discovered that Karina could read. They eagerly wanted to know what the book said and protested that it was unfair for only Rishitoka to hear it, insisting that they wanted to listen as well. Rishitoka told them not to bother Karina. Karina replied that she did not mind reading for more people. One of the children wondered what a princess was, while another asked what princesses were like. Before Karina could answer, Rishitoka explained that princesses were humans like Karina, beautiful, delicate, charming, and noble. One of the children asked whether Karina really was a princess, while another admired her beautiful eyes and hair. Rishitoka readily agreed. Karina, however, gently clarified that she was not truly a princess. Clearing her throat, she resumed reading the story. A few hours later, the children left the tent, waving goodbye and thanking Miss Karina. They eagerly asked to be told when she read the next part and insisted that they not be left out. Karina and Rishitoka watched them leave, and once the children were out of sight, Rishitoka remarked that they were quite a handful. She apologized, admitting that she had not expected the children to want to listen. Thinking it over, she guessed they had probably been listening from the moment she brought Karina there. Karina let out a sigh and remarked that, as a human, she was surely a rare sight in the village. Naturally, the children would have wanted to take a look. Rishitoka then praised Karina's reading, saying she had a wonderful voice, and wondered whether she had often read aloud back in her homeland. Karina reflected that she could not really say, but she remembered how, when they were little, Aurora would call her big sis and beg her to read books to her. Aurora had always said that she loved listening to Karina read because, even though she could not go outside to play, she never felt lonely while listening to her stories. The memory abruptly ended, and Karina immediately dismissed the idea of reading stories to other people. Rishitoka simply concluded that it was Karina's natural kindness showing through. Karina insisted that anyone could do as much and that Rishitoka was exaggerating. After a brief pause, Rishitoka admitted that the fairy tale book actually belonged to her. Karina's interest was immediately piqued. Rishitoka explained that she had bought it because the cover had caught her attention. Back when the village had only rarely traded with humans, a traveling merchant had passed through, and the book had been among the goods for sale. The cover featured a graceful girl dressed in strange yet beautiful clothing, and the princess depicted on it had fascinated her. However, because she could not read, she had never known what the story was about. She was genuinely happy that she had finally learned its contents that day and thanked Karina for reading it. Karina blushed as she acknowledged the story. She decided that, since there were still several days before the snowfall eased enough for her to return home, she would read the entire book to Rishitoka before leaving. Even with the children's interruptions, there should still be enough time to finish it. Hearing her mention returning home, Rishutoka realized Karina had misunderstood something. Noticing Karina's confusion, she explained that the reason she had brought her there that day was to find her a job in the village. Karina was left wondering why she would need a job in the village. Rishutoka explained that, since Karina would be living in the village from now on, having something to do would surely help her feel more at ease. She was relieved that Karina seemed to enjoy the translation work. Startled, Karina immediately objected, reminding her that she had intended to return once the snowfall had lightened. Rishutoka could not understand why she would go back. In her eyes, Karina had already become her wife, and she wondered whether Karina even had anywhere else to return to. Caught off guard by Rishutoka's words and actions, Karina froze as Rishutoka happily remarked that everything had worked out well and that Karina's situation should feel much more secure now. Wrapping Karina in a hug, Rishutoka began thinking about what needed to be done next, deciding that Karina's clothing should be taken care of first. She even considered building a new house because the current one felt too cramped. Karina could only stare in disbelief as she realized that Rishutoka was genuinely trying to have her settle down in the village and live there with her. Rishutoka then suggested that they head home. Meanwhile, in the capital of Lux, Orlando reviewed a report before him. The servants standing nearby flinched as Orlando erupted in anger upon learning that contact had been lost with the assassins sent after Karina. The servant reported that multiple bodies had been discovered at the foot of the mountains and that they believed the assassins had been counterattacked. Orlando found it impossible to believe. Karina had only been accompanied by a few servants, so he questioned who could have been capable of defeating them. Referring to them as assassins, he then dismissed them as nothing more than washed-up mercenaries. In his view, they had probably let their guard down, lost their footing, and fallen into the valley. Frustrated with their incompetence, he complained that he was always the one left to clean up after their failures. Deciding on a new course of action, Orlando concluded that he would simply send his regular forces instead. Since the target was only a single woman, he believed they would eliminate her without difficulty. At that moment, Aurora arrived and greeted Orlando. He welcomed her warmly. Aurora advised that there was no need to mobilize the army over a single woman, as such a large-scale operation would attract attention and might cause Karina to become suspicious. Orlando asked what she proposed instead and invited his beloved Aurora to speak her mind. Aurora calmly requested that he leave everything to her. Chapter 4 began in the northern land. Karina stepped out of Rishutoka's tent and immediately felt the bitter cold. It had snowed yesterday, the day before that, and it was still snowing today. She wondered when she would finally be able to leave the village. That morning, she had watched Rishutoka getting dressed to go out and had wondered whether she was going somewhere. Rishutoka greeted her cheerfully, pleased to see that she was already awake, and explained that she had some business to take care of that day. She remarked that Karina might get lonely without her but asked her to be a good girl and wait until she returned. Confused, Karina could not understand why the very person trying to make her settle in the village was now leaving her behind. She questioned whether she was expected to remain there alone. Suddenly, Rishutoka grabbed both of her hands and enthusiastically declared that she understood exactly how Karina felt because she also did not want to be separated from her. She quickly reassured Karina that everything would be fine. Karina had been about to insist that she was not worried at all, but she stopped herself and instead pretended that she would, of course, be terribly lonely. Karina reminded herself that she needed to pretend to care and get along with Rishutoka. Realizing how close she had come to exposing her true feelings, she stayed quiet. A short while later, Rishutoka apologized for leaving her alone and explained that, as compensation, she had prepared a room just for her. She recalled that Karina had become upset when she climbed into bed with her the previous day and admitted that she had not realized humans valued having their own personal space so much. Karina reflected that the problem had been more than simply having her own space. Laughing awkwardly, Rishutoka apologized again before pulling back a curtain and inviting Karina to look inside, confident that she would like what she saw. Karina stepped forward and found a beautifully furnished room. She looked around at the drawers, pillows, chests, and other furnishings, all decorated in vivid shades of blue that resembled a clear winter sky. Rishutoka eagerly asked for her opinion. Karina admitted that it was not bad. Delighted, Rishutoka laughed and happily concluded that Karina liked it. As Karina gently touched the furniture, she remained inwardly astonished by the beast tribe's self-centeredness. She resolved to finish translating the books as quickly as possible, secure the beast's assistance for her revenge, and leave the village before staying there any longer drove her mad. Her thoughts drifted back to when Rishutoka had expressed how happy she had been to finally learn the story in the fairy tale book and had thanked Karina for reading it. Karina dismissed the sentiment as foolish. She returned to the book and continued reading. The story spoke of a child blessed by the spirits of nature who grew into a beautiful princess. Treasured by everyone as she was raised within the palace, the princess became the target of monsters that desired to claim her beauty for themselves. Eventually, Even those within the palace grew weary of constantly protecting her. Those people were none other than her own family. Her father declared that peace would come if she sacrificed herself, while her mother accepted it as her destiny. Thus, on a day of fierce snowfall, the beautiful princess was taken deep into a dark, desolate forest. The one who had led her there released her hand and walked away. As the princess watched them leave, she wondered if they were abandoning her there, but no answer ever came. Karina reflected on the time when she had been accepted into the royal household as the future queen. However, because Orlando had wanted Aurora as his betrothed, the prince had quickly lost interest in her. Even so, she had not been alone. As the crown prince's fiancée, she had enjoyed certain advantages. As long as she held that title, people gathered around her regardless of how openly the prince ignored her. Some flattered and groveled before her, others acted friendly, while still others whispered that everything they did was for her own sake, as though they found satisfaction in making sacrifices for her. Looking back now, she questioned all of it. On the day she had been driven out of the capital and sent to the remote northern borderlands, not a single one of those people had come to see her off. As Karina looked back toward the castle before boarding her carriage, Aurora had watched her departure from within its walls. Only then had Karina realized that she had been the only one who believed she was not alone. Back in the present, Karina sat quietly and glanced around the room. She recalled Rishutoka happily saying that she was glad Karina liked it. Karina inwardly remarked that, after talking so much about being a good partner, Rishutoka had promptly left her behind. She concluded that Rishutoka truly did whatever she pleased. She returned to the fairy tale and continued reading. Alone in the dark forest, the princess was surrounded by monsters lurking among the trees. Deep growls echoed from behind her, while sinister laughter drifted from ahead. The princess wandered through the forest for days until the snow caused her to lose her footing. Freezing in the cold, the flame of her life gradually faded. At that moment, someone called out to her. It was a wolf who lived in the forest. Seeing the pitiful state of the princess, the wolf invited her to rest at her home if she wished, and the two of them set off together. After walking for some time, they arrived at a small house. It was blue and entirely made of ice. Karina instinctively looked around her room and noticed the similarity in color. She continued reading. The princess was greeted by a completely blue home filled with a blue bed, blue furniture, and blue walls. Every piece was beautiful, and although she immediately liked the house, it was made of ice and could not keep her warm. The wolf then decided to build a new home for the two of them. According to legend, if a wolf climbed the eastern hill on the day of the year's heaviest snowfall and built a house from the fir trees growing there, the spirits would grant their blessing. Believing it to be the perfect home for them, the princess agreed, and the wolf immediately began building it. The completed house was warm and comfortable, allowing the princess to sleep peacefully. On the first night they spent together in their new home, the wolf plucked a star from the sky as proof that she would make the princess happy. The princess took a bite from the star before handing it back so they could eat it together and share that happiness. As Karina read, she recalled Rishutoka asking whether she still had not realized it. Her thoughts returned to the snowy mountains where Rishutoka had been starving and where Karina had shared her prey with her. She realized that the story closely resembled how she and Rishutoka had first met. Yet she questioned whether their encounter had not simply been a coincidence. Then another thought occurred to her. Could Rishutoka's blue furniture also have been more than coincidence? Turning to the final page, she found only the words "to be continued," leaving her to wonder if there was another volume. Her thoughts were abruptly interrupted as Rishutoka burst into the room, having finally returned after making Karina wait for so long. Karina welcomed Rishutoka back and wondered where she had gone. Rishutoka laughed at her curiosity, refusing to reveal everything just yet, but admitted that she had gone to the hill in the east. Karina paused as the words of the fairy tale echoed in her mind. It was said that, on the day of the year's heaviest snowfall, anyone who traveled to the hill in the east and built a house from the fir trees growing there would be blessed by the spirits. She quietly repeated the words "the hill in the east" to herself. Rishutoka noticed the change in Karina's expression before spotting the open book behind her. Realizing that Karina had already translated it, she eagerly wondered whether she had reached the next part and what happened in the story. Karina searched for an answer but faltered when Rishutoka suddenly remarked that the princess in the book looked exactly like her. Left speechless, Karina listened as Rishutoka admitted that, when they had first met, she had almost believed the princess from the book had come to life. The more she compared them, the more alike they seemed. Rishutoka happily concluded that she was incredibly fortunate to have met the princess of her dreams. As Karina looked at Rishutoka's cheerful expression, memories of her life in Chloria resurfaced. She remembered how the people who had adored her had ultimately failed to stand by her when it mattered most. In her eyes, Rishutoka was no different from everyone else she had ever met. Rishutoka was not truly interested in Karina herself. Like everyone else, this beastkin only saw her as a convenient substitute for the princess from the story. Pulling herself together, Karina apologized, explaining that she had simply been lost in thought. Concerned, Rishutoka wondered whether she was all right and whether translating the book had exhausted her. Karina shifted the conversation back to the fairy tale and explained that the story was not actually complete. There was probably another volume somewhere. She reasoned that, if Rishutoka was curious about what happened next, she would not want to wait too long for the continuation. Therefore, if Rishutoka could find the next volume, Karina would read it for her. Delighted, Rishutoka immediately threw her arms around Karina in a hug, happily saying that she understood and that she was already looking forward to it. Karina inwardly criticized herself for being so childish. She could not believe she had allowed herself to be affected by someone like Rishutoka. Rishutoka was nothing more than a means to achieve her revenge, so whatever feelings she held were irrelevant. All Karina needed to do was continue pretending whenever she was with her. Whether it was love or anything else, it was all equally foolish. Even so, she replied that she was looking forward to it as well. Chapter 5 began in the northern lands at the hill in the east. The sounds of construction echoed across the area as the Wolfkin worked together to build a house. Voices rang out from every direction, calling for someone to lift materials, asking whether supplies remained, warning others to be careful because it was dangerous above, requesting tools, and scolding Rishutoka for carelessly throwing things instead of handing them over. Nearby, Karina sat quietly, watching the construction. Before long, the wolf woman with the eye patch approached and stood beside her. Looking at the progress, she remarked that the house was finally starting to come together. Since it would be the new home for Karina and Rishutoka, she found the effort impressive, especially because their current house was not actually that cramped. Even so, Rishutoka seemed incredibly motivated to build a new one. Karina recalled how, the moment Rishutoka had returned after gathering materials, she had immediately begun working on the new house. The words from the fairy tale resurfaced in her mind. It was said that, on the day of the year's heaviest snowfall, a house built from the fir trees growing on the hill in the east would be blessed by the spirits. Karina quietly admitted that Rishutoka certainly did seem motivated. Teasingly, the wolf woman wondered whether Karina had already lost interest. At that moment, Rishutoka called out from the construction site, demanding to know what they were talking about so happily. She accused the wolf woman of trying to steal Karina away while she was busy working. The wolf woman protested, asking just how poorly Rishutoka thought of her. She explained that she had only been keeping Karina company because she had seemed lonely after Rishutoka left her by herself. Startled, Rishutoka immediately hurried over, wrapped Karina in a hug, and pleaded with her to wait just a little longer. Once their new house was finished, she promised to shower Karina with affection. After a brief pause, Karina thanked her. Delighted, Rishutoka praised Karina for always being so kind. Karina quietly questioned whether that was really true. Seeing the exchange, the wolf woman remarked that she would leave the two of them alone and see them later before walking away. After the wolf woman departed, Rishutoka suddenly remembered something she had wanted to mention. While gathering wood on top of the hill, she had spotted a very strange building. Curious, Karina wondered what she meant. Rishutoka explained that she had intended to tell her about it earlier but had completely forgotten after returning. The building had resembled those found in human towns, but it had been enormous, almost as large as the place where the princess had lived in the fairy tale. She admitted that she had never imagined such a place truly existed. Karina asked whether the place Rishutoka was describing, the one where the princess had lived, was a castle. Rishutoka realized that was the proper name for such a building. She remarked that it had been an incredible structure and wondered whether a princess lived there as well. Karina considered the possibility. There were very few buildings in the northern lands that could truly be called castles, and as far as she knew, most had long since fallen into ruin. Only one remained intact and was still in use. She concluded that Rishutoka must have seen her castle. Surprised, Rishutoka asked if it had really belonged to Karina. Karina confirmed it. She explained that, when she had gone outside to assess the situation, the assassins had chased her away. While desperately trying to escape them, she had encountered Rishutoka. Reflecting on it, Karina admitted to herself that kidnapped by would have been a more accurate description than met. Rishutoka happily remarked that this made Karina seem even more like the ideal princess, having lived in such a magnificent castle. Karina then asked what the castle had looked like. She had left only a couple of servants behind, and with their mistress gone, she expected they would have fled by now. Rishutoka repeated the phrase, "a couple of servants," to herself. Noticing her confusion, Karina wondered whether she had said something strange. Rishutoka explained that, if only a few servants had remained, then it could not have been Karina's castle after all. She had seen many people living there. Numerous horses had been tied outside, and every window had been brightly lit. If only a handful of people had been staying there would have been no reason to keep lights burning in every room. She wondered if things had been different while Karina still lived there. Karina replied that they had only lit the rooms they were actually using. Convinced, Rishutoka concluded that it must have been another castle instead. Karina lowered her gaze before asking whether Rishutoka wanted to visit the castle again. Curious about the sudden request, Rishutoka wondered what had prompted it. Karina explained that she had not known there was another castle in the area and wanted to see it for herself. She added that it would also be a good opportunity for the two of them to go on a date. Rishutoka paused at the unfamiliar word. Karina explained that, where she came from, a date was when a couple spent time together to have fun and deepen their love for one another. She then asked what Rishutoka thought. Understanding at last, Rishutoka concluded that it was simply Karina's custom for couples to spend time together. Delighted, she immediately agreed, deciding that they would visit the castle together. As they prepared to leave, Karina's thoughts lingered on the details Rishutoka had described, the large number of servants, the many horses, and the lights glowing in every window. None of it matched the castle she remembered, and an uneasy feeling settled over her. After setting off toward the castle, Karina noticed the traces of an avalanche along the path. The sight convinced her that Rishutoka must indeed have seen her castle after all. Yet if that was true, she could not understand why it had changed so drastically. That place had been the only home she had left. Lost in those thoughts, she suddenly came to a stop as Rishutoka announced that they had arrived. In front of them stood the enormous castle. Rishutoka marveled at its size and wondered if they should build their new house just as large. Karina remembered it as a dark, gloomy castle that had mocked her exile to the northern lands, yet now it was completely different. She could not understand what had happened. Karina entered the castle, and the moment she stepped inside, servants hurried over to greet her. Ignoring them, she silently looked around, taking in the decorations. She could barely recognize the place. The furnishings were almost like. Her thoughts abruptly halted as the sound of something crashing echoed through the hall. Turning toward the noise, she saw Seal staring at her in shock. Seal rushed over in relief upon seeing Karina alive. She explained that they had been searching for her the entire time. As Karina tried to speak, Seal hurriedly added that violent tremors had shaken the earth after Karina's departure, making her fear the worst. Thankful that Karina was unharmed, she listened as Karina instead asked what had happened to the castle. Seal explained that Lady Aurora had come to visit. She proudly pointed out the new decorations, furniture, and servants, saying Aurora believed it would be unpleasant for Karina to spend the winter in such a castle. Seal also revealed that Aurora had brought something with her because she did not want Karina to be lonely anymore and no longer needed it herself. According to Aurora, it had once been something precious to the two of them. Seal regarded Aurora's actions as incredibly kind. As Karina imagined Aurora saying those very words herself, she pictured Aurora pitying her for spending the winter in such a miserable castle before deciding to return something she no longer wanted. Without hesitation, Karina slapped the small stuffed dog out of Seal's hands before stomping on it. Shocked, Seal cried out in disbelief. Karina coldly concluded that Seal truly was a mediocre failure of a maid. She questioned who Seal truly served. In her eyes, the answer was obvious. Seal served Aurora, the prince's current fiancée. That alone explained everything. Seal had allowed Aurora into Karina's castle without permission and had let her alter the place however she wished because she regarded Aurora as her true mistress. Seal immediately apologized profusely, insisting otherwise, but Karina cut her off. She declared that she had heard enough. First Seal had disobeyed her and now she was talking back. Karina warned her not to disappoint her any further. Turning away from Seal's desperate calls, Karina thought bitterly of her hated sister. She wondered how Aurora had expected her to feel after being lured away from the castle, only to return and find even the last place she could call home defiled by Aurora's presence. Karina quietly apologized that Seal would have to remain in a castle like this, but stated that there was no need to worry because she would not be returning. Confused, Seal questioned what she meant. Karina replied that she had finally found a true home for herself and that she would be leaving with Rishutoka. As Rishutoka silently accepted Karina's embrace, Karina bid farewell to both Seal and the castle. She instructed Seal never to let anyone enter again. In her heart, she resolved that she would never allow anyone to take her home away from her again. She asked whether Seal understood. Snow continued to fall as Karina and Rishutoka walked away from the castle. Rishutoka realized that it truly had been Karina's castle after all. Karina confirmed it, though she admitted it had changed so much that she no longer considered it to be hers. She explained that she had once been the fiancée of the prince of that country and had been destined to become a true princess. However, her sister had taken everything from her. Turning to Rishutoka, Karina confessed that she wanted revenge against the country. She wanted to take her revenge and become the happiest person in the world. To do that, she asked Rishutoka to lend her strength. She wished for the two of them to leave together, spend their days enjoying themselves, and go on a long, long date. Rishutoka asked whether that was truly Karina's deepest wish. Karina answered that it was. Laughing softly, Rishutoka accepted her wish without hesitation. She declared that she could never ignore the wishes of her beloved princess and vowed to remain her faithful partner. Karina smiled. In her heart, she believed that there was now nothing left for Aurora to take from her. In the distance, the castle and its servants felt the earth rumble once more. As they looked up, they saw an avalanche rushing toward them. They desperately tried to flee, crying out for help, but were ultimately swallowed by the snow. Karina thanked Rishutoka. Rishutoka affirmed that Karina was her wife and belonged to her alone. She loved her. The avalanche buried everything beneath it, leaving only the small stuffed toy hidden under the snow. Chapter 6 began with a little girl recalling that a picture book from the human country she had read when she was young told the story of a lonely princess abandoned by her family. With the help of her friend, the princess had been able to make her wishes come true. However, the girl could no longer remember whether happiness had truly awaited the two of them at the end of their tale of revenge. In Cloria, during the year 492 of the royal era, at the Secretariat Historical Archives in the capital, Lux Court, the scribes gossiped among themselves about rumors of a witch supposedly wandering around the city. One of them had heard someone claim that the witch was actually the spirit of His Highness's former fiancée. Another dismissed the story as ridiculous, believing witches did not exist and that such tales were nothing more than superstition. At one of the tables, a scribe continued writing until someone repeatedly called out her name. Eve Solis immediately responded, and a man handed her the document she had requested earlier, asking whether it was the correct one. After confirming that it was exactly what she needed and thanking him, she watched as he dropped into the chair across from her with a groan. He had struggled to obtain the document because the librarian had refused to release it, even after being told it was necessary for the compilation and archival of important historical records. Despite that, he had somehow managed to sneak it out. He then reminded her to summarize it properly so that his efforts would not be wasted, as it concerned the Crown Princess scandal. Eve readily agreed and resolved to produce an excellent write-up. Eve worked as a scribe in the court of the Kingdom of Cloria, where her duties mainly consisted of compiling and archiving historical documents. At present, that work centered on the Crown Princess scandal that had occurred 2 years earlier. As Eve read through the book, she learned that several years ago a woman had been accepted into the royal family as the Crown Prince's fiancée. However, she had been described as an exceptionally cruel woman. Outraged by her arrogant and brazen behavior, the Crown Prince had annulled their engagement and exiled her to the northern lands. According to the rumors, misfortune soon befell her, and she lost her life in an avalanche shortly afterward. She had been the daughter of a provincial noble, but Eve suddenly stopped reading when she reached a burned-out page. She realized that everything had been removed after all. The woman's name was gone. Having spent the past few months researching the incident, Eve had noticed that while many documents and reports covered its general contents, there were very few, if any, descriptions of the woman herself. She sighed, thinking that knowledge about the woman was essential to properly compile a document on the incident. Yet hardly anything about her remained. Suddenly, whispers spread throughout the archives as word circulated that the king had arrived. The scribes were astonished that His Majesty would personally visit their humble halls. The king acknowledged them and asked whether the compilation of the archives was progressing well. After receiving confirmation that everything was proceeding smoothly, he glanced toward Eve and recognized her as the young woman who had graduated at the top of the scribe class the previous year. Surprised that he remembered her, Eve listened as he praised her talent, noting that she had become the youngest court scribe ever and, moreover, a woman. He then expressed interest in seeing what she was currently working on. Eagerly, Eve showed him her work. The king flipped through the pages and read the title concerning the condemnation of the previous crown princess to be for her crimes. Eve explained that there was not much reference material available, making the work difficult, but that once it was completed, before she could finish, the king stated that it was truly regrettable, but all mention of the so-called crown princess scandal was to be erased. Eve stood frozen in shock as he tore her work in half. She could scarcely believe what she was seeing. The king declared his disappointment, explaining that he had already ordered every record of the incident to be disposed of, yet some still remained. He ordered that everything related to it be destroyed immediately as well. Before Eve could protest, he added that, since she had only recently begun serving at court and considering her inexperience, he would overlook the matter. His kingdom would have no history of ever welcoming such a wicked villainess into the royal family. Unable to respond, Eve remained silent as the king instructed the other scribes to educate her properly, and one of them acknowledged the order. A few hours after the incident, Eve sat in dejection, thinking about how hard she had worked on that document. It became clear to her that the royal family regarded having accepted such an infamous woman as the crown prince's fiancée as a stain upon their history. Because of that, they intended to preserve no record of what had happened. The thought filled her with outrage. Slamming her fist against the table and grinding her teeth, she thought that the royals were simply falsifying and rewriting history however it suited them. She questioned what legitimacy historical records could possibly have under such circumstances. One of the scribes noticed the dangerous aura surrounding Eve and remarked upon it. Eve continued thinking that the royal family was merely trying to cover everything up. On top of that, they had wasted perfectly good paper. She wondered whether the king even knew how much one of those sheaves cost. Tears welled up in her eyes as she berated herself, forcing herself not to cry. Wiping her tears away, she thought of the distant, remote village where she had been born. Eve remembered standing with her parents in a forest as someone told them that once they left the village, they could never return, asking whether they were certain they still wished to leave. Her father had replied that they had to, because things like those did not last in a village. When Eve was still young, her parents left the village where they had lived, taking her with them, and eventually settled in a small town near Luck. It was there that she first laid eyes on books. Books contained fantastic stories imagined by people as well as accounts of things that had actually happened. Regardless of their contents, she had been fascinated by the way writing could preserve facts for decades or even centuries. Before long, it had become her dream to write down the things she had seen and heard and leave them behind for the world of tomorrow. Back in the present, Eve sighed as she reflected that the document had been the very first assignment she had received after being hired. Her colleagues had immediately burned all the documents after being reprimanded. Earlier, they had apologized to her, explaining that after the king's orders, their hands had been tied. Eve wondered what had become of their pride as scribes. Even so, a cursory investigation suggested that the former crown princess appeared to have been a woman destined to be condemned sooner or later. Accepting someone like that into the royal family would have damaged its public image, so she could understand the king's reasoning to some extent. The thought lasted only a moment before Eve rejected it completely. Erasing history simply because the royal family was ashamed of it made no sense. If they believed every trace of the woman needed to disappear, then making such a villainess the crown prince's fiancé in the first place had been the real mistake. She then questioned why the royal family had ever accepted someone who had supposedly been destined for condemnation from the beginning. If the woman had truly been so wicked that she deserved to be erased from history itself, then surely someone should have investigated her before approving her engagement to the crown prince. Remembering her dream of recording what she had seen and heard for future generations, Eve resolved not to let this opportunity slip away, no matter how long she would be allowed to work at the court. It had been her lifelong dream. This time, it would not matter whether her findings became part of the kingdom's official historical records, because she would investigate the crown princess scandal herself. A short while later, Eve visited one of the consorts. After hearing that Eve wanted to know more about the crown prince's former fiancé and wished to learn anything she remembered, no matter how minor, the consort admitted the request was rather sudden and that she was not entirely sure what to say. She then recalled that the former fiancé had apparently opened her salon almost every day, summoning numerous nobles for extravagantly lavish gatherings. She had also heard that the salon itself had been excessively luxurious and wondered how much of the royal treasury had been spent on it. The consort remarked that the woman was now supposedly buried somewhere in the borderlands, which she found rather sad, believing His Highness could have shown her a little more sympathy. She also found it remarkable that scarcely a year after his former fiancé's death, he intended to marry her sister, though perhaps he was simply capricious. Even so, she admitted that, thanks to the woman's absence, men had now begun visiting her as well, which she considered wonderful. After speaking with the consort, Eve approached a nobleman. He wished that the crown prince's former fiancée would not be mentioned, remarking that he had believed she was already dead after the castle where she had been exiled was buried in an avalanche. He recalled that she had made a habit of imposing unreasonable demands on anyone who approached her, so he doubted many people had been saddened by her death. He had also heard that some people had donated their entire fortunes to her. After speaking with the first nobleman, Eve approached another. He described the crown prince's former fiancée as a woman who always spoke as though she were the most important person in the world, behaving as if everything revolved around her. In his eyes, she had become unbearably full of herself simply because she was engaged to the crown prince, making her a pitiful woman. Following a full day of investigation, Eve found herself outside the castle grounds. Sitting on a bench with a sigh, she reviewed everything she had gathered. The report spoke of misuse of funds, immoral behavior, and a lack of manners and respect. She could not say she had learned much that was new. As she reflected on her findings, she concluded that the rumors surrounding the crown prince's former fiancé appeared to have been true, making her earlier question of why the royal family had accepted someone like her seem entirely beside the point. Just then, a woman shrouded in a dark veil appeared before Eve and asked whether she was the one investigating the crown prince's former fiancé. Eve looked at the woman, who introduced herself as someone who had once served as a maid for the woman's family. Having heard that someone was asking about her former mistress, she had come in the hope of speaking with that person. Eve readily welcomed the opportunity, explaining that almost nothing about the former fiancé remained in the court's records and asking the woman to share everything she knew, no matter how trivial. The former maidservant agreed and said she would recount everything she remembered. Before doing so, however, she asked Eve to promise her one thing. When Eve asked what she meant, the former maidservant pleaded with her to uncover the truth about the former prospective crown princess. She explained that she had adored her mistress, who had once been kind, well-mannered, and never complained about anything. She wished for Eve to investigate why Karina, had become so cruel, and then tell her the truth. Chapter 7 began with Eve listening as the former maidservant repeated her wish for Eve to investigate the reason Karina had become so cruel so that she, too, could know the truth. Eve looked at the woman in confusion and questioned who Karina was. The former maidservant explained that Karina Amandia Crocus was the name of the crown prince's former fiancé. She went on to explain that although House Crocus was distantly related to the royal family, its status was far too low to justify selecting one of its daughters as the crown prince's fiancé over the daughters of more influential noble houses. However, in recent years the palace had been plagued by factional conflicts and repeated attempts by members of the royal family to seize power. As a result, the royal family had chosen a daughter from House Crocus, which had remained uninvolved in politics, to serve as a buffer against the ongoing turmoil. They needed someone who would steadfastly support His Highness throughout the upheaval at court and faithfully fulfill the duties of princess consort. Recalling the days at the Crocus estate, the former maidservant explained that the royal family had originally set their sights on the younger daughter of House Crocus, Aurora. Lady Aurora was a wise and prudent girl who tended to be quiet and restrained in her speech, qualities that likely convinced them she would make a suitable consort for His Highness. Unfortunately, Aurora had been frail from childhood and would develop a fever from even the slightest exertion, making life at the royal court impossible for her. Because of this, her older sister, Karina, had been chosen in her place. According to the former maidservant, Karina had never once talked back to her parents or gone against their wishes. She had always respected her family's customs and rules and had been a model older sister who consistently put Aurora before herself. She had not been the infamous villainess described in rumors but a noble lady who could proudly hold her head high wherever she went. For that reason, everyone had believed she would become a wonderful princess consort. Eve was left speechless. The former maidservant apologized as painful memories resurfaced, but Eve stopped her. Regaining her composure, the former maidservant admitted that she would not deny the fact that Karina had become a villainess in the eyes of the royal court and the entire kingdom. Even so, the Karina she had known had never been that kind of person. Seeing Eve's disbelief, she confessed that perhaps she was merely searching for something that would allow her to remember Karina fondly. She pleaded with Eve to find even the smallest fragment of the Lady Karina she had once known within the villainess she had become. If Eve could do that, she would be forever grateful. Deeply moved by their conversation, Eve bowed to the former maidservant in thanks before they parted. Later, Eve sat alone in her room, reflecting that the self-proclaimed former maidservant of House Crocus had known nothing about the former princess consort after she entered the royal court. Stretching her arms, Eve concluded that no matter how much she investigated, there was simply no information about the former crown princess-to-be following her arrival at court. At that point, speculation was all she had left. Eve recalled everything she had learned during her investigation. The former maidservant had described Karina as a lady who could proudly hold her head high wherever she went. The consort had said that Karina regularly summoned numerous nobles for lavish gatherings. The former maidservant had insisted that everyone believed she would make a wonderful princess consort. One nobleman had remarked that he doubted many people had been saddened by her death, while another had claimed that Karina had become unbearably full of herself simply because she was the crown prince's fiancée. As Eve reflected on these accounts, she realized that Karina, the eldest daughter of House Crocus, and Karina, the crown princess-to-be, seemed like two entirely different people. She wondered whether Karina had possessed such an unpleasant personality from the beginning and had merely been waiting for the chance to wield her authority. Another possibility crossed her mind, that the former maidservant had been lying, but the woman's sincerity had made that difficult to believe. Eve instead considered whether something had caused Karina to change. Remembering that Karina had only been nominated after her younger sister could not accept the engagement, she questioned whether Karina had hated becoming the crown prince's fiancée so deeply that it had transformed her entire personality. Elsewhere, the loud tolling of a bell echoed through the air. A man proclaimed that the saintess would now become the Holy Mother and must offer herself for the sake of the village and the world. The villagers chanted for the saintess to deliver the divine child, while the man declared that only then would they prosper for all eternity. As the chanting continued, he commanded her to obey the oracle and enter the sacred matrimony with them. A girl cried out for someone, anyone, to help her and take her away from that place. The villagers' voices grew even louder as they called upon the saintess to conceive the divine child. Suddenly, one of the villagers shouted that the saintess had escaped. A man immediately ordered that she be brought back, while the girl desperately called out to Miss Wolf for help. Eve suddenly jolted awake, slowly lifting her head from the table before glancing out the window. Hearing the birds singing, she realized she had fallen asleep. The dream had once again brought back distant memories. As she stood up, one of the pages from her investigation slipped onto the table, and her expression became serious. A short while later, Eve visited the archives to request a holiday. Later, Eve spoke with a carriage driver before climbing aboard. As the carriage rattled along the road, she gazed out the window and reflected on the idea of an unwanted marriage. It was something she had heard about before. On the outskirts of the city of Zenus, children played together. They eagerly called for a woman to sing them a song, show them a drawing, and play with them. Surrounded by the children, the woman groaned before reminding them that she could only be in one place at a time and that everyone would have to wait for their turn. Just then, she heard the sound of an approaching carriage. Looking toward the road, she excitedly announced that Eve had returned. In the distance, someone stepped out of the carriage. The woman ran over to greet the newcomer. Eve smiled, removed her hat, and greeted Juno as she returned. Meanwhile, in the northern lands, Rishutoka spoke with the other wolfkin while Karina stood nearby. Rishutoka approached Karina and informed her that the wedding between the prince and her sister was scheduled to take place the following month. She remarked that, if Karina truly wished to make the greatest impact, that occasion would be the ideal opportunity. She assured her that the preparations for her revenge were progressing smoothly and that there was no need to look so anxious. Karina replied that she was not anxious in the slightest because Rishutoka was with her. Touched by those words, Rishutoka embraced her and declared that, once Karina had taken her revenge, they would officially marry and live happily together in the village as a married couple. After a brief pause, Karina agreed, adding that she would become a wonderful princess. Chapter 8 began in the past with a young Eve reading a book. She looked up in surprise when the door opened and her father called out to her. Realizing she had snuck into the room again, she apologized, but her father assured her that she did not need to apologize because he was not angry. Noticing the book in her hands, he asked whether it was the one she had been looking at that day, observing that she truly loved books. Unfamiliar with the word, Eve wondered what a book was. Her father explained that the object she was holding was called a book, and asked whether she could read what it said. Realizing she could not read the letters, he asked if she knew what letters were. When Eve admitted she did not, he explained that a story was made up of letters. As Eve stared intently at the pages, her father laughed softly before pointing to the writing and explaining that those were letters. After studying them for a while, Eve admitted that she had always believed they were drawings. Her father agreed that they certainly looked that way to someone who did not know their meaning. He explained that humans used letters to form words, and those words were then preserved in book. Amazed, Eve eagerly asked what the words on the page meant. Her father hesitated before admitting that, to tell the truth, he could not read very well himself. Laughing at his own confession, he explained that he had always wanted to learn to read and had spent dozens of years trying, yet he still was not skilled enough to read books. There had also been limits to what he could learn back in the village, especially since the other wolfkin had never shown any interest in reading, likely believing it would not be useful even if they could. Looking back down at the book, Eve wished she knew what the words meant. Her father replied that he could at least read the title if she handed him the book. After she did so, he paused to recall it before remembering that the title was The Monster Princess. Back in the present, Juno announced that the food was ready and that the main dish, a new recipe she called Juno's Special Welcome Back Evie Pie, had been completed. Eve and the children looked on in amazement as Juno asked everyone to make room on the table. Eve remarked to herself that it looked delicious. As soon as Juno set the pie on the table, one of the children reached toward it, only for Juno to stop them immediately. She then turned to Eve, held out a spoon, and declared that the first bite belonged to her. Eve hesitated as one child marveled at the enormous serving, while another remarked that there was no point underestimating a wolfkin's bite size. Insisting that it was not that large, Juno encouraged Eve to open her mouth. After a brief moment of thought, Eve did so, and Juno fed her the pie. Eve chewed thoughtfully before deciding that it was delicious. Delighted, Juno warmly welcomed Eve home once more. Eve smiled as she acknowledged the greeting. The children quickly interrupted, insisting that they should stop talking and start eating because they were starving. Laughing, Eve agreed, and the meal finally began. They all returned to the dining table. After making sure everyone was seated properly, Juno encouraged them to begin eating. As the meal continued, Eve reflected that Juno lived with her at their home, which also served as an orphanage, though it was not the village where Eve had been born. While Eve was lost in thought, Juno called to her. When Eve turned, Juno leaned over and licked a bit of food from her cheek, before explaining that something had been stuck there. Blushing, Eve protested inwardly that Juno had perfectly good hands and could have simply wiped it away instead. Juno laughed, while the children complained that the food would grow cold. Watching the lively exchange, Eve reflected that this was simply the kind of relationship she and Juno shared. After dinner, they put the children to bed. Once everything had settled down, Juno remarked that Eve's sudden visit had come as a surprise since she normally sent a letter beforehand. Eve agreed and silently apologized. As Juno followed her into their room, she wondered whether Eve had simply needed a breather. Eve admitted that was partly true, but before she could continue, Juno gently took hold of her shoulder and reflected that it was unlike Eve to worry about things. Eve insisted that she worried sometimes as well. Juno knew that, but she also believed Eve always remained calm and solved whatever troubled her on her own. Because of that, she found it unusual that Eve had returned home because of a concern. Eve thought Juno greatly overestimated her. Juno disagreed, instead believing that whatever the issue was, Eve was not truly worried by it. Eve remained silent. Juno giggled, taking her silence as proof that Eve was as dependable as ever. To her, Eve had always been strong and composed, the same Miss Wolf who had long been her hero. Although she admitted she had become a little too insistent with her questions, she also felt Eve did not need any special reason to come home. Simply talking with her again and seeing her face after so long made Juno happy. Moved by those words, Eve suddenly remembered something. She gently squeezed Juno's hand before sitting upright. After Juno looked at her in concern, Eve cautiously explained that Juno did not have to answer if she did not wish to. After hesitating, she brought up the subject of being forced into an unwanted engagement. She explained that she had been investigating a woman named Karina as part of her work, although the investigation itself was somewhat separate from her actual duties. Several years earlier, Karina had entered the royal court as the crown prince's fiancée. Before eventually being denounced by the crown prince, she had been regarded as a villainess responsible for every imaginable evil. After her crimes were exposed, the crown prince had publicly condemned her and exiled her to the bitterly cold northern borderlands, where she had later been caught in an avalanche and died. Some people at court had even considered it no more than the fate she deserved. Eve admitted that she had initially believed those accounts herself. However, someone who had known Karina before she entered the royal court had told her a very different story. Karina's younger sister had originally been chosen as the crown prince's fiancée, but because she was frail, Karina had been selected in her place. According to those who had known her then, Karina had once been a lady who could proudly hold her head high wherever she went. Even though she had only become the crown prince's fiancée as her sister's replacement, everyone had believed she would make an excellent princess consort, completely unlike the villainess described in rumor. The more Eve investigated, the more she felt that the stark difference between how people viewed Karina before and after entering the royal court stemmed from her engagement to the crown prince. After listening quietly, Juno realized that this was the reason Eve had come to see her. Eve acknowledged that it was a rather terrible reason. Juno merely chuckled, reminding herself that she had already told Eve she never needed a reason to come home. Juno then fell into thought. Reflecting on the subject of an unwanted engagement, she gazed out the window as tears gathered in her eyes. After a long pause, she concluded that perhaps the problem had not been that the engagement was unwanted, but that it had been wanted. Eve was puzzled by that thought, but Juno reflected that when someone was a good girl and a good child, they wanted to live up to the expectations placed upon them. She herself had once been like that, and she believed Karina had been as well. Chapter 9 began with Juno recounting a story. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful girl who lived happily, surrounded by the love of her family. One day, however, her parents died, leaving her completely alone until a kind priest took her in. From then on, she was lovingly raised as a special child beloved by God. That girl was Juno, the sacred priestess. Juno remembered her childhood, when the priest called for her to begin the day's lessons. After her real parents had suddenly died in an epidemic, she had been left without any relative. The priest had taken her in, and before she truly understood what had happened, she found herself living with him in a small village deep within the forest. One day, he explained that she was a special child loved by God. Her beautiful hair and clear blue eyes were proof that she had been blessed, and when the proper time came, she would serve as the saintess by sharing the love she had received from God with the people of the village. On another day, Juno remembered feeding a stray kitten when the priest found her. He was alarmed by what she was doing. Juno had only wanted to help because the kitten had been alone and hungry, but the priest sternly warned her not to go near such impure things. The frightened kitten immediately ran away. Looking at Juno's hands, the priest lamented how dirty they had become. After composing himself, he reminded her that she was a special child. Even if it had only been a kitten, they could not know what kind of corruption it carried. Though her compassion was understandable, she should never have touched it so carelessly. Juno apologized, and the priest accepted her apology as long as she understood her mistake. He then led her in a prayer, asking God to forgive her, explaining that the Lord saw all and that they sought nothing but salvation and prosperity for his believers. As the priest prayed with his hands clasped together, Juno quietly lowered her head and joined him. Looking back on those days, Juno reflected that everyone in the village believed in God. Her adoptive father, the priest, had been among the most devout of them all. Having received a divine revelation concerning a right of prosperity, he had devoted himself to raising her as a child worthy of God. After the prayer ended, Juno wondered whether that was all she was. She flinched beneath the priest's serious gaze. Rising to his feet, he praised her prayer, expressing confidence that the Lord would graciously forgive her mistake. Even so, he warned her never to become complacent. Her duty as the saintess would be to spread the true Lord's love, and she must never open her heart to anything else. After thinking quietly, Juno promised that she would. In her heart, Juno had simply wanted the priest to like her. After losing her parents, she had become an orphan, and and she remembered him telling her that he looked forward to seeing her grow. He had raised her alone despite the village's poverty. Wanting to repay his kindness and terrified of being left alone again, Juno resolved to grow up quickly and become someone splendid who could bestow God's love upon the village, just as the priest wished. Years later, the priest congratulated Juno, telling her that the long-awaited day had finally arrived. He declared that the entire village would at last receive salvation and praised her for growing up so well. Juno tried to speak, but the priest continued, explaining that everyone had eagerly awaited this day and that only the ceremony remained. He expressed his complete faith in her ability to fulfill her role before leaving to attend to the preparations, instructing her to wait there for a while. Juno obediently agreed. As she watched him leave and heard the door click shut, she wondered whether completing the ceremony would finally make him happy. Looking out the window, Juno noticed a familiar cat and wondered whether it was the same one she had encountered years ago. She stepped outside and happily observed how much it had grown. When a small kitten peeked out from behind it, her delight only grew. Then she remembered the priest's warning never to go near such impure creatures. Worried about what would happen if he found them, she hurriedly tried to shoo the cats back into the forest, urging them to return to the bushes where they would be safe. As the cats ran off in the wrong direction, she called after them to turn back. Her heart skipped a beat when she suddenly heard voices nearby. Approaching a nearby window, she realized they belonged to her father and another man from the village. Hidden from sight, she listened as the priest remarked that light-colored hair and jewel-like eyes were exceptionally rare and admitted that even he had never expected Juno to grow into someone so beautiful. He proudly declared that she was truly stunning. Hearing those words brought tears to Juno's eyes, but she continued listening. The other man remarked that the children Juno would bear would surely fetch a high price. The priest agreed, expressing his hope that her children would become even more beautiful than she was. As Juno listened in stunned disbelief, the man speculated about whether the children would inherit her hair, eyes, face, or figure. The priest explained that beautiful hair was always valuable, so even an unattractive child could be sold if it possessed fine hair. The man added that a baby with beautiful eyes could likely be sold immediately, though he did not know what would happen to it afterward. The priest then revealed that he intended to have Juno bear a different villager's child every year under the guise of a prosperity right for the village. He remarked that she trusted him completely without a hint of doubt. The other man laughed that such prosperity would certainly enrich them and praised the priest for finding girls like her. He commented that if Juno had grown into such a treasure, then her mother must have been equally beautiful and regretted not taking her as well. The priest explained that Juno's mother would have resisted too fiercely if he had tried to take her, making it more efficient to kill the parents instead. The other man remarked that he was willing to bet the priest had killed her because she fought back, though the priest denied it. Horrified, Juno covered her ears and shut her eyes as the realization settled over her that the priest had killed her mother. She hurried back to her room and struggled to compose herself. Moments later, the door opened and the priest called for her, informing her that it was time for the ceremony. Without a word, Juno followed him. As the ceremony began, Juno fled. The villagers immediately realized she had escaped and shouted for her to be stopped and brought back. Desperately running, Juno cried out for someone, anyone, to help her. Before she could get away, someone seized her hand. It was the priest, who asked whether she intended to break the promise she had made to him. Juno denied it, but the priest insisted they return. As Juno struggled and begged to be released, the priest condemned her as an ungrateful child. Remembering how she had once hoped completing the ceremony would make him happy, Juno shut her eyes and silently pleaded for help. At that moment, someone suddenly appeared and kicked the priest to the ground. Juno immediately hurried behind Eve, who looked upon the sight of a group of adults ganging up on a single girl with clear disapproval. With tears filling her eyes, Juno could only stare at Eve. Eve asked whether Juno was all right and what had happened. Unsure of what to say to someone she had never met before, Juno simply explained that those people were chasing her. Even so, she could not understand why a stranger who knew nothing about the situation would come to her aid. Desperately pleading to be taken away from that place, she called out to Miss Wolf for help. Eve immediately held out her hand, resolved to take Juno away, and urged her to run. As Eve pulled her forward, Juno felt the warmth of another person's hand for the first time. The reassuring touch that steadily guided her to safety became a memory she knew she would never forget for the rest of her life. Back in the present, the children gathered around Eve, clinging to her and refusing to let her leave. Eve gently reminded them that she had to return to work, but the children tearfully protested, insisting that she did not have to go and should stop working altogether. As Eve tried to calm them, Juno noticed that Eve was carrying more luggage than when she had arrived and wondered whether she was taking something with her. Eve explained that she was bringing along several books her father had left behind. There were surprisingly many books that did not exist in the royal library, and she found herself wondering where her father had managed to obtain them all. Juno laughed, remarking that at least it explained where Eve had inherited her love of books. She then handed Eve something for the journey, which Eve gratefully accepted. Afterward, Juno observed that describing the books as having been left behind made it sound as though Eve's father had passed away. Eve reflected that she had not known how else to describe it, as her parents had simply told her they were setting out in search of books. Juno watched Eve enjoying the food and remarked to herself that it looked delicious. She then called Eve's attention and reflected that, even if she had never learned the truth back then, she might still have found a kind of happiness. She had believed that if she continued to have faith, her father would eventually come to love her. Perhaps she could have remained content had she stayed ignorant of the truth. If she had simply abandoned herself to that life, she might never have been hurt. Even so, Juno did not regret learning the truth. Discovering it, being betrayed by her father, and fleeing the village had all been nothing more than a prelude. Those events had allowed her to meet Eve. Because of that meeting, she had been able to begin a new life and find new happiness. That was how Juno chose to see everything that had happened. Before Eve could respond, one of the children excitedly announced that the cart had arrived. After loading her belongings onto the cart, Eve apologized to Juno, feeling that everything had been so hectic during her visit that they had never truly had the chance to relax together. Juno assured her that it did not matter, because seeing Eve again had made her happier than anything else. Even so, she asked Eve to come closer. When Eve leaned in, Juno kissed her on the cheek. She admitted that, even while Eve had been there with her, her thoughts had remained occupied by someone else, making her feel a little jealous. She asked Eve to make sure all of her work was finished before returning home next time. Touching her cheek, Eve smiled and silently agreed. As everyone waved Eve goodbye, Juno reflected that she had never completely believed her father. Although she had always behaved in the hope of earning his approval, she had secretly wished that someone she had never met would one day come and take her away from that village. So, despite claiming to feel indebted to him, she realized that, deep down, she had long since given up. Closing her eyes, Juno silently prayed that Miss Karina would also find happiness, just as she had after meeting Eve. Elsewhere, back in the city, someone reached out and took hold of a wanted poster depicting the witch. Chapter 10 began in the forests on the outskirts of Cloria, where a guard was slammed against a tree with a heavy thud. Rishitoka stepped toward him and leaned close, asking him to tell them what he knew about Aurora and the prince's wedding. She explained that they wished to offer their congratulations, but unfortunately did not know the time or place where it would be held. The guard glared past Rishitoka and recognized her as the witch from the rumors. Declaring that the wedding would be a glorious day for the entire kingdom, he vowed never to reveal anything to someone like her. He also questioned what she was plotting by keeping a monster at her side. Rishitoka remarked that he certainly talked a great deal. Grasping his face and leaning in closer, she quietly concluded that if he refused to tell them no matter what, they would simply have to send him to the frozen lands. As she bared her fangs, the guard's eyes widened in terror. He screamed before collapsing unconscious. Rishitoka observed with surprise that he had merely fainted and dismissed him as pathetic. Karina remarked that they still had time and could try a gentler approach later. As they walked away, Karina removed her hood, letting her hair fall freely. A broad smile spread across her face as she reflected that the time had finally come. At long last, she would be able to take her revenge on the kingdom, on her family, and on her sister. Rishitoka was delighted, believing that as long as Karina was happy, she would be happy as well. After a while, Rishitoka asked what Karina intended to do once her revenge was complete. Karina looked at her in surprise before recalling that they were planning to have their own wedding afterward. Rishitoka acknowledged that, but explained she meant what Karina wanted to do after that. When Karina remained silent, Rishitoka pointed out that revenge would finally lift the burden from her heart, marking the true beginning of their married life together. She encouraged Karina to think about what she had always wanted for herself. Karina realized she had never considered that question. Once her revenge was over, she would no longer be bound by the past. She would finally be free. After taking revenge, she could leave everything behind and live simply as Karina. Turning away from Rishitoka, she admitted that Rishitoka was right and that she would have to think about it. Rishitoka happily wondered what Karina's answer would be and looked forward to finding out. As Karina continued walking, she reflected that all she needed to do was complete her revenge. Surely then, the clouds hanging over her heart would finally disappear. Glancing back at Rishitoka, she quietly wondered whether, after everything was over, she might even come to love her. Passing through the trees, Karina and Rishitoka emerged into an opening overlooking the castle of Cloria. Later that morning, inside the palace, the main hall buzzed with chatter and gossip as guests continued arriving in their carriages. Looking around in amazement, Eve felt her heart pounding. She recognized Marquis Sedalia and his wife, Count Damon and his family, and Sir Makar, the famed explorer. To her, they were practically living pieces of history. Eve's senior scribe remarked that many nobles and foreign guests had been invited for the occasion. Filled with excitement, Eve marveled at the gathering. Her senior reminded her not to get carried away or attempt to speak with any of them, as commoners like the scribes were not permitted to approach such distinguished guests. After assembling the scribes, the senior scribe instructed everyone to remain in their quarters. The central bell would ring when the ceremony was about to begin, and they were to make sure they did not miss it. Until then, however, there would be no work for the day. The scribes acknowledged the instructions in unison. Eve then asked whether Lady Aurora's parents would also be attending the ceremony. The senior scribe looked at her in confusion before confirming that they would. Another scribe with black hair immediately tried to stop the conversation. Laughing awkwardly, Eve explained that she had only been wondering whether she might be able to ask them a few questions after the ceremony. Both scribes scolded her, and the senior scribe realized she was still investigating the matter of the prince's former fiancé despite having been severely reprimanded the other day. Eve could only laugh nervously. After a moment, the senior scribe admitted that he might be able to arrange some time for her after the ceremony, though it would have to wait until the following day or later. Eve reflected that he was always weak when his subordinates made requests. He added that he would ask around, although it was unlikely they would agree. Eve thanked him for trying. The senior scribe then dismissed everyone, reminding them to gather at the cathedral once the central bell rang. The scribes acknowledged the order before dispersing. Later, as Eve walked through the palace corridors, she reflected that there was still plenty of time before the ceremony began. She decided to spend it reading the books her father had left behind and that she had brought with her. Suddenly, she paused upon overhearing two guards talking nearby. One mentioned that the witch from the recent rumors had reportedly been seen north of the city and that someone had even spotted her near the capital not long ago. Another guard replied that he had seen the wanted posters. A third added that he had heard the witch had abducted several guards and was accompanied by a monster. The other guard remarked that while he could believe the rest, the story about the monster was impossible. The black-haired guard noted that it was only a rumor after all. Having heard enough, Eve quietly continued on her way. Back in her room, Eve set her books down on the table with a heavy thud. Looking through the stack, she identified one as a book about celestial bodies and another as the botany book her father had brought for her. Her attention soon settled on the volume she had been searching for, The Monster Princess. Sitting down, she noticed that it was the second volume. After searching for several minutes, she concluded that the first volume was missing. Wondering whether she had forgotten to bring it with her, she sighed and decided it was not a problem, since she had already read it and knew how the story began. Opening the book, Eve continued reading. The story told of a poor princess who had been abandoned by her family and driven from her home. Deep within the forest, she met the wolf, who gifted the beautiful princess all manner of treasures. He gave her warm nights free from the cold, a house built of fir wood, and even picture books from the human lands for her enjoyment. The wolf declared that he would do anything for the poor princess and wished to know whether she had finally found happiness. The princess, however, sadly shook her head. Though the wolf treated her with great kindness, she still could not call herself happy. When the wolf asked what troubled her and whether she desired even more gifts, the story continued. Turning the page, Eve read that the princess averted her eyes and confessed that, despite being surrounded by beautiful things, all she ever saw in her dreams was her old home. Her heart remained captive there. Covering her face with her hands, she sorrowfully wondered what she had to do to free herself from such loneliness. The wolf fell silent before giving her even more treasures, continuing to shower her with gifts while looking forward to the day when he and the princess would finally find happiness together. Just then, the central bell rang. Eve gasped, sprang to her feet, and hurried out, realizing she had to leave immediately. Meanwhile, the prince stood gazing out of a window. Reflecting on the rumors spreading throughout the city about a witch and a monster, he dismissed them as ridiculous and entirely inappropriate for such an important day. He also scoffed at the stories claiming that the ghost of his former fiancée was wandering about, concluding that the commoners must have been terribly bored to invent such nonsense. The prince instructed Charlotte to tighten security regardless of the rumors, as a precaution. Above all else, he ordered that not a single hair on Aurora's head be allowed to come to harm. Charlotte bowed in acknowledgement. A moment later, the door opened. Aurora entered the room, greeted the prince with a respectful bow, and approached. Smiling warmly, the prince remarked that she looked stunning and that the dress suited her perfectly, befitting his consort. As a servant bowed nearby, the prince stepped forward and added that she was worthy of bearing the ring. The prince showed Aurora the ring, explaining that it was the queen consort's ring, worn for generations by those who had married into the royal family. It was the ring he would place upon her finger during the wedding ceremony, and he believed it would suit her better than it had any queen in history. Aurora looked quietly at the ring without responding. Noticing her silence, the prince asked whether something was wrong and wondered if she was nervous. Aurora denied it, but before she could continue, the door opened. Both of them turned as a servant informed Lady Aurora that everything was ready. The sound of trumpets echoed through the cathedral as the invited guests began filing inside. Eve hurried through the crowd and managed to reach her assigned place, relieved that she had barely arrived in time. Her senior scribe immediately reprimanded her for being late, leaving Eve to respond with nothing more than an awkward laugh. Looking around the cathedral, Eve's eyes sparkled with amazement. A short while later, the priest formally announced the beginning of the wedding ceremony between His Highness Orlando Lux Chlorua, Crown Prince of the Great Kingdom of Chloria, and Lady Aurora Amandia Crocus of House Crocus. A murmur of admiration spread through the audience as Aurora entered. Watching the ceremony unfold, Eve reflected that it was the first royal wedding most of them had ever witnessed. No expense had been spared, and although she had never seen Lady Aurora in person before, she found her every bit as beautiful as people claimed. Her thoughts were interrupted when she overheard nearby guests whispering about the witch and wondering what she was after. Others quietly mentioned the rumored monster as well. Eve noticed that even here the rumors persisted. Hearing the word monster reminded her of the monster princess, and for reasons she could not explain, she found herself unable to stop thinking about the book. She felt an overwhelming urge to read the rest of it as soon as possible, though she could not understand why. Fragments of the story resurfaced in her mind. The wolf had continued giving his beloved princess more treasures than ever before, granting every wish she voiced while devoting himself to her day and night. Yet despite everything, the princess's heart remained fixed upon her former home. Determined that they would someday find happiness together, the wolf had resolved to fulfill even that deepest wish. Back in the present, the priest announced that, as the declaration of their marriage, the prince would now place the ring upon Aurora's finger. Before he could finish the ceremony, and before the prince could slip the queen consort's ring onto Aurora's hand, a deafening crash suddenly shattered the moment. The cathedral's great windows exploded into countless fragments, and the queen consort's ring was knocked from the prince's hand, flying across the hall. Aurora looked up just as two figures burst through the cathedral windows. Carried in Rishutoka's arms, Karina fixed her gaze upon Aurora as they entered. Chaos immediately erupted. The guests screamed in panic and scrambled to escape. Amid the confusion, Eve stood frozen. Cries echoed throughout the cathedral as people demanded to know what was happening, called for help, and shouted that someone had been injured. Keeping her eyes fixed on the altar, Eve struggled to comprehend what was unfolding before her. She watched as the two figures landed before everyone. Rishutoka and Karina landed gracefully amid the shattered glass. As Karina stepped away from Rishutoka and walked toward the center of the altar, she loudly greeted the assembled ladies and gentlemen, remarking that the palace must have been rather lonely without her. Hearing her voice, the prince glared at her and silently uttered Karina's name. Standing tall with Rishutoka behind her, Karina faced the prince and Aurora. A smile spread across her face as she regarded the man who had once been her fiancé. She then stepped closer to Aurora, gently touched her face, leaned in, and greeted the future queen. Chapter 11 began immediately after Karina and Rishutoka's dramatic entrance. Rishutoka drew in a deep breath and unleashed a tremendous bellow that echoed throughout the cathedral, overwhelming everyone present and shattering the remaining windows. As the deafening sound subsided, the prince shouted at Karina. Amid the chaos, a woman quietly murmured Karina's name. At that very moment, a large piece of debris broke loose above her and came crashing down. Unable to move in time, she closed her eyes and braced for the impact. When nothing happened, she opened them in confusion and found Eve standing before her. Groaning from the effort, Eve was relieved that the debris had missed the woman and checked whether she had been injured. The woman replied that she was unharmed. As Eve looked more closely, her eyes widened in recognition. The woman she had just saved was Karina's former maidservant. Before they could speak further, a nearby bystander hurried over to ask whether the woman was all right. A moment later, everyone's attention returned to the altar as the prince demanded to know how Karina could still be alive when she was supposed to be dead. Karina laughed, remarking that she had expected events to unfold that way because they all possessed such simple minds. She observed that news of his former fiancée's death must have come as quite a shock to him, even if he had never loved her, and she wondered whether he had at least granted her a grand funeral worthy of the crown prince's consort. The prince furiously declared that he would never have done such a thing. To him, Karina was the greatest stain upon the kingdom's history, the most evil of women, a vile and wicked witch. He insisted that not a single person in the world would have mourned her death. Karina's expression became blank. She quietly reflected that the prince had never even given Karina a funeral. Poor little Karina. That, she mused, must have been why she had returned as a ghost with a monster under her command. The prince silently reeled in disbelief. Karina then turned her attention to Aurora, wondering whether she had anything to say to her beloved older sister after so many years apart. Aurora remained silent. Karina remarked that perhaps their emotional reunion had left her speechless. Brushing her hair aside, she fixed Aurora with an angry glare and bitterly reflected on how convenient it was that Aurora only had to remain silent for everyone to adore her. Memories resurfaced of the words people had always spoken to Aurora, sympathizing with how frightened she must have been and how terrible everything must have felt for her. Karina contrasted those memories with the words always directed at herself. She remembered their parents insisting that, as the older sister, Karina simply had to endure it. Aurora quietly pleaded with her sister to stop the madness. Karina responded by reflecting on the fact that, after finally speaking, Aurora had chosen to call it madness. Embracing that description, Karina declared that, to Aurora, it must indeed look like utter madness. Aurora could never understand because she had grown up loved by everyone and wanting for nothing. Karina, on the other hand, had lived a life in which no one acknowledged or praised her. That was why she had sworn revenge. Clenching her fist, Karina directed her hatred toward everyone who had mocked, deceived, and cast her aside. She named her mother and father, Prince Orlando, Aurora, and everyone gathered in the cathedral as the targets of her vengeance. Then, allowing her hands to fall to her sides, she calmly declared that she would take her revenge and finally obtain happiness for herself. From that point onward, she would live for her own sake. Unable to find the right words, Aurora could only address her as her sister. The cathedral fell silent as everyone watched the two sisters face one another. Nearby, the former maidservant whom Eve had rescued tried to stand while calling out to Karina. Eve quickly stopped her, warning her not to move because the shattered glass might cut her. The former maidservant then asked who the person standing beside Karina was. Looking toward Rishitoka, Eve explained that she was one of the Wolfkin, who usually lived in the far north. Before she could continue, the former maidservant wondered whether a Wolfkin was a monster. Eve looked at her and denied it. Rising to her feet, she nevertheless found herself wondering why a Wolfkin was there. As she thought about the Wolfkin, the princess, and the way everything was unfolding, the entire scene began to feel strangely familiar. Rishitoka stepped down from the altar and hurried toward the side of the cathedral. The nearby guests fled from her in terror, shouting for her to stay away. She bent down, picked up a ring, and returned to Karina. Showing it to her, she indicated that it was the item Karina had wanted. The prince reacted immediately. Karina recognized it as the queen consort's ring. Rishitoka gently placed the ring onto Karina's finger, and Karina quietly admired it, remarking to herself that it was beautiful. Turning back toward Aurora with a smirk, Karina wondered whether her dear younger sister would allow her older sister to have the ring instead. Memories surfaced of all the times Karina had surrendered things for Aurora's sake. The prince furiously protested that the ring did not belong to Karina. Ignoring him completely, Karina concluded that there was nothing more to do and decided that it was time for her and Rishitoka to leave. As they prepared to depart, the prince desperately called after Karina before angrily demanding to know where the guards were. Carried in Rishitoka's arms, Karina declared that she would never again see anyone or anything in that place. Not the palace, not that land, and not even Aurora. Rishitoka looked at her in surprise as Karina wrapped her arms around her neck, leaned close, and quietly expressed her wish for them to return home, to the home they shared. Rishitoka readily agreed. With Karina still in her arms, she leaped through the shattered cathedral window, landed briefly on the frame, and sprang away once more. Everyone could only watch as Karina escaped, while uneasy murmurs spread throughout the ruined cathedral. Eve's thoughts returned to the monster princess. She realized she had recognized the parallels all along. In the story, the wolf had continued giving the princess more and more treasures, always looking forward to the day they would finally be happy together. Eventually, the wolf had even gone so far as to take the lives of the family that had abandoned the princess. A chill ran through Eve as she realized how closely reality resembled the story. She desperately tried to remember what came next. In the tale, after both her former home and her family were gone, the only one left beside the princess was the wolf. However, Eve's eyes widened and the color drained from her face. Realizing what could happen next, she urgently insisted that they had to pursue Karina and Rishitoka. The former maidservant whom Eve had rescued looked at her in confusion and tried to calm her down, but Eve remained convinced that failing to act would end in disaster. Before she could gather herself, angry voices erupted throughout the cathedral. People declared that Karina had truly been the witch, accusing her of selling her soul to the devil. Others denounced her as utterly evil, rotten to her core, and a monster in human form. Chaos spread as the crowd demanded that she be found and burned at the stake. The furious chanting continued until Aurora suddenly silenced the entire cathedral. Everyone fell quiet as Aurora walked toward Eve. After expressing her gratitude for saving her mother, Aurora asked what Eve had meant when she warned that everything would end in disaster. Eve explained that she believed the Wolfkin woman was attempting to recreate a story in real life. It was the tale of a Wolfkin and a princess, in which a princess who had suffered a miserable life eventually found happiness. Eve believed Rishitoka thought that by reenacting the story, she and Karina would also achieve a happy ending. Yet if events continued as they were, Lady Karina would lose her life instead of finding happiness. Far away in the northern lands, a warm fire crackled inside Rishitoka and Karina's firwood house. Karina climbed into bed, and Rishitoka soon joined her. Delighted that Karina had finally achieved the revenge she had long desired, Rishitoka embraced her and reflected that they could now begin living happily together as a married couple. She also thought about sharing the happy news with everyone else in the village, cherishing her beloved princess. Meanwhile, Eve recalled the ending of the monster princess. In the story, the princess had never come to love the wolf. Unable to understand why the princess would not return his feelings despite everything he had done in pursuit of their happiness, the wolf ultimately devoured the princess, bringing her life to an end. Chapter 12 continued with the donkeys witnessing that the wolf had eaten the princess after all. It was not surprising since she was a human. One donkey agreed that the bad ones could get eaten for all they cared. Selfish humans were nothing but food, and it remarked that it served the bad princess right for not doing as she had been told. Back in the hall, it echoed with chatter as people moved through the space while an attendant assisted them. Inside a room, Aurora asked Eve if she thought what she believed was happening. Aurora mentioned the picture book about a wolfkin and a princess and asked if Eve was certain. Eve confirmed, explaining that the story followed a poor princess who was taken in by the wolf, and that part of it showed the two of them finding happiness together. Aurora continued the explanation by recalling that, in the end, the princess was eaten by the wolf. Eve offered no response. Aurora then questioned why the wolf would kill the princess after giving the impression that it liked her. Eve reacted awkwardly and explained that the story had never been told in much detail. She added that she had neither read nor even seen the story herself and supposed the explanation might be found in the next book. Aurora accepted the explanation. Orlando suddenly declared the idea ridiculous. He questioned Eve on whether she truly believed the contents of a picture book were being acted out and that Karina would die because of a story. He demanded proof, insisting that reality was not some childish delusion. He continued complaining that Eve claimed everything was happening exactly like in that story simply because she had seen what happened and decided it resembled the contents of her little picture book. Orlando pressed further, questioning whether she was claiming that events were deliberately following the story. He insisted that no one would believe such a lie. Eve inwardly admitted that Orlando was not wrong. She explained that, in the story of the wolfkin and the princess, the wolfkin killed the princess's family for abandoning her. She admitted that all she had was a feeling that she had seen everything unfold somewhere before, but that it was not enough proof to claim that everything followed the story. Even so, she still had a bad feeling about the situation. A chill ran through her, covering her body in goosebumps and making her want to shiver. Orlando smirked and remarked that Eve could not even argue against his point. He suddenly changed his tone and stated that believing her explanation would not be bad at all, repeating himself with growing smugness. Eve reacted with confusion at his sudden change in stance. Orlando declared that Karina was an evil criminal and reasoned that if events truly followed the picture book and she was murdered by the monster, it would spare them the trouble of carrying out her punishment. Eve reacted in shock and could hardly believe him. She wondered who would believe such a lie and admitted to herself that she was not certain whether she was right. Orlando then suggested creating their own picture book that warned anyone who forgot their place would be eaten by a great big hungry monster and end up like the witch Karina. The prince and his subordinates laughed. Eve reacted with frustration and clenched her fist. Suddenly, Aurora asked what had to be done for her sister to stay alive. Orlando called out Aurora's name in surprise and remarked that she was truly too kind for her own good. He pointed out that she had first gone along with Eve's delusion and was now trying to show mercy to the witch who had interrupted their wedding. He urged her to stop, insisting it was not worth her time or effort to become involved in something so troublesome, and suggested leaving the matter to the army. As he spoke, Aurora fixed him with a cold, intense glare that left him unsettled. She explained that while the royal family might see Karina as a source of annoyance or a troublesome criminal, it would leave a bad taste in her mouth if that was how Karina met her end. She assured Lord Orlando that she would not do anything that would cause him trouble. Orlando accepted her response. Aurora then turned to Eve and declared that they should go stop her sister. She asked whether Eve would help her, and Eve agreed. Without hesitation, Aurora decided that they first had to gather documents containing information on Wolfkin. She instructed Charlotte to contact the court secretariat and request access to the closed stack. Charlotte accepted the order. Aurora then informed Orlando that the wedding should be postponed. She explained that they would announce that the incident had caused His Highness great grief, and that he would be recovering for the time being. Orlando was surprised, while the attendant acknowledged the instruction. Aurora turned to Orlando once more and told him that he need not involve himself in the matter. She advised him to go somewhere safe, adding that the big bad wolf that had sniffed out their plans might come after him. Orlando fell silent. A nearby man remarked that Aurora could have simply left things alone as Orlando had suggested and observed that Lady Aurora was too kind for her own good, unlike that witch. He wondered if she intended to capture the demon along with the witch. Hearing this, Eve remembered Aurora's earlier remark that, although the royal family might regard Karina as a source of annoyance or a troublesome criminal, it would leave a bad taste in her mouth if that was how Karina met her end. Eve reflected that anyone asked about Lady Karina would call her the epitome of evil as though it were an unquestionable fact, and she was certain Lady Aurora understood that as well. Aurora then called to Eve and suggested they leave. Eve wondered to herself what was truly going on inside Lady Aurora's head. The scene shifted to another place where heavy snow fell outside as strong winds raged. Inside a warm room, one figure complained about the freezing cold and remarked that another blizzard had started again. Another welcomed the newcomer back and invited them to warm themselves by the firepot. The figure continued shivering from the cold. Someone asked whether the others had heard the news about the thing Karina wanted, adding that those involved had apparently managed to carry it out successfully. Another reacted with surprise and interest. Someone asked whether that meant Rishtoka had gone to do something outside the village, and the other confirmed that she had. They explained that Rishtoka had been overjoyed about it and that they could now proceed with the marriage rites. Someone remarked that Rishtoka had been truly excited. Another laughed and agreed, noting that she had been looking forward to it for a very long time. Someone observed that it had been around 2 years, and another commented that it was impressive how Rishtoka had managed to restrain herself from laying her hands on it for so long. Having learned the news, they decided they should also do their part and prepare for the marriage rite. They remarked that Rishtoka, who had once been so small, was finally getting married and that they would all be busy for a while. They agreed to make it a grand celebration befitting the daughter of the village chief. One remarked that good food was all that mattered, and the others continued chatting happily. They also thought that Karina must be very happy as well. One Wolfkin observed that Rishtoka had done so much so they could get married. Another agreed, adding that anyone in her position would be overjoyed. Meanwhile, Karina lay awake in bed, remaining silent and deep in thought. Chapter 13 began with Karina recalling her childhood. As a child, she often felt that she tried much harder to make those around her happy. Someone called her name. Her mother leaned in and drew everyone's attention to Karina's drawing, pointing out that she had drawn all 4 of them. Her father praised the picture, saying it looked very good and that Karina was very skilled at drawing. Karina held up the picture while her mother called Aurora over and pointed out that her older sister had drawn it. Aurora reached out and tapped the drawing tool, surprising both parents, who reacted with delight. Karina's mother held Aurora and remarked on how wonderful it was that her older sister loved her so much. Karina admitted to herself that she had only wanted to see them all smile, but things had not turned out that way. Back at the castle, Orlando complained while attendants dressed him. He grumbled that people were saying Aurora was weak and sickly, so Karina had been forced to settle for her sister instead. He noted that the common folk were looking down on royalty. He repeated the words that he had been told over and over again. He had been reminded that marriage was not something to undertake alone and that, even if he was engaged to someone he did not care for, he still had to treat that person with respect because she was the future queen. He remarked that it was not as though he had it easy either. Karina had responded only with apologies. Orlando glared sharply before suddenly throwing a cup of tea at her. Clicking his tongue, he declared that if Karina rotted to her very core, he would immediately annul the engagement and order Aurora to be given to him instead. He then stated that he had had enough and dismissed her. Karina stood in silence, wondering why Orlando was making such an expression. She questioned whether she had done something wrong and believed she was only trying to do what everyone expected of her. People whispered among themselves, asking whether anyone had heard the rumors about Lady Karina. They remarked that she had ruined His Highness's mood again. The gossip continued as they claimed they had heard Lady Karina had thrown another tantrum, expressed sympathy for His Highness, and cautioned one another to speak more quietly so she would not overhear. Karina quietly called Aurora's name. She reflected that the harder she tried, the more it felt as though she was losing her mind. Karina suddenly awoke with a sharp gasp, breathing heavily as short, shaky laughs escaped her. She pressed her hands against her face, realizing it was the same nightmare once again. She told herself that it was simply a vision of what had been awaiting her as she sniffed softly. Beside her, Rishtoka already knew all of this. The scene shifted to a few days after the attack at the Crown Prince's wedding ceremony. Eve sat in the library, thoughtfully looking through books. She examined titles such as Travels to the Far North, on the monsters of northern folklore, and the mysterious man-eating monsters of the northern lands, noting that they contained nothing but rumors and hearsay. To help formulate a strategy for the operation to bring Lady Karina back, they had begun gathering documents about monsters. However, descriptions of them were rare, and the few that existed came from folklore, making them unreliable. Eve also observed that there were surprisingly few documents on Wolfkin. As she turned the pages, she wondered whether they had simply been grouped together with monsters. Eve admitted that she knew little about Wolfkin beyond what her own family had told her and thought it would have been helpful if there had been more books about them. She suddenly froze as she remembered the picture book. Judging from its contents and illustrations, she believed the wolf in the story was most likely a Wolfkin and that Lady Karina and her companion were attempting to recreate the plot of the book. She also noted that the book was not titled The Wolf Princess, but The Monster Princess. Eve reflected that Wolfkin and monsters were not the same thing. However, she considered that humans might regard Wolfkin and the monsters of folklore as one and the same. She wondered whether the two terms had somehow become synonymous, whether her own interpretation was mistaken, or whether there was something more to Wolfkin that they did not yet know. Charlotte suddenly called out to Eve, startling her so badly that she jumped with a shout. Eve complained that Charlotte had frightened her and asked her not to sneak up behind her so suddenly. Charlotte replied that there had been nothing sudden about it, explaining that she had already called Eve's name several times. She remarked that it was Eve's own fault for becoming so absorbed in her reading. Eve acknowledged this and apologized. Charlotte sat beside her and asked how the search was progressing. She remarked that she hoped Eve was not about to tell her that no progress had been made at all. Eve hesitated, prompting Charlotte to press her for an answer. Eve admitted that, through everyone's combined efforts, they had exhausted all the archives within the palace. However, all the information they had uncovered regarding monsters amounted to little more than rumors, and the same was true of everything they had found concerning the picture book. Charlotte asked whether they had been unable to confirm if the book had a continuation. Eve replied that she was quite certain it did, since the first volume ended with the words, "to be continued." However, because even the first book was not kept within the royal court, finding the second volume was completely out of the question. She suggested issuing a proclamation across the entire country asking the people to search for the second book in the hope that someone might come forward with it. Charlotte argued that such a method would take too long and concluded that their only remaining option was to rely on their men-at-arms instead. She resolved that the army of Gloria would eliminate the monster and recover Lady Karina from its clutches while making her safety their highest priority. Eve listened and reflected that Lady Charlotte was a military woman who was not only highly skilled but also the royal guard most trusted by Lady Aurora. Eve laughed and remarked that she doubted humans would be able to defeat a wolfkin through pure force alone, though she admitted she could not say for certain. She reflected that they were facing an opponent with the ferocity of a beast and the cunning of a human, making her prefer to avoid a battle if possible. She wondered how she could make Aurora understand. Suddenly, Aurora called Eve's name and asked how she was doing. Charlotte immediately stood and bowed, asking Aurora's forgiveness. She explained that Aurora had come personally because she was worried and complained that the scribes were taking too long to gather and summarize everything. Aurora greeted Charlotte and noted that she was there as well. Charlotte explained that she had only been urging them to speed up the search and asked for a little more time. She added that if Aurora did not wish to wait for the scribe's report, the royal guards were ready to depart immediately at her command. Aurora replied that it was quite all right and explained that she had come because she wished to discuss something with Eve. She asked whether Eve could spare her a moment. Eve readily agreed. Charlotte began to excuse herself and accompany them, but Aurora raised a hand to stop her. She explained that the discussion might become rather complicated and asked Charlotte to kindly give them some privacy. Charlotte reluctantly accepted before suddenly grabbing Eve's arm and warning her to make sure no incidents occurred. Eve firmly assured her that she understood. Later, Aurora and Eve walked to a quiet pavilion. Aurora apologized, believing she had startled Eve. Eve fumbled for words, uncertain how to respond, before recalling that Aurora had wanted to speak with her. Aurora gestured for Eve to sit, remarking that they should not remain standing while they talked. Eve sat down. Aurora explained that she had heard Eve was investigating her sister. She noted that Eve had originally intended to question their parents about Karina, but considering their current condition, Aurora believed Eve could instead ask her. She asked what Eve thought of that arrangement. Eve reacted with surprise, and Aurora responded with a soft laugh before expressing her gratitude. Aurora then asked whether Eve had also received a request to uncover the truth about Karina and bring it to light. She admitted that she did not have much information to offer and knew little about what Karina had done after moving there. Even so, she believed that, regarding Karina's actions as the former crown princess consort-to-be, most of the rumors were true. Eve accepted her explanation. Eve then asked Aurora why she wished to spare Lady Karina's life when everyone called her the greatest villainess of the century. She pointed out that even His Highness Orlando had once said it would be better if Karina were dead despite having originally chosen her as crown princess. Eve also recalled that Aurora herself had admitted that most of the rumors about Karina were true. She observed that while Karina had lived in the palace, she had done nothing but behave arrogantly, tarnish the name of her family, and now ruin Aurora's wedding. Eve reflected that anyone would think Aurora would be ashamed to call Karina her sister and would resent her, and she questioned why that was not the case. Aurora fell silent for a moment before acknowledging that everything Eve had said was true. She explained that she had never once imagined that Karina's cruelty had been directed toward her. She stated that Karina was someone she respected greatly and treasured more than anyone else. She added that she had always wanted to grow closer to her sister, and that was why she wanted to be the one to save Karina. Chapter 14 continued with Aurora recounting her childhood. She shared that her earliest memory dated back to when she was around 3 years old. For her birthday, her parents had given her a music box, but she had carelessly broken it. She supposed that even then she had not been very attentive, having broken her present on the very day she received it. Afraid that her parents would be angry, she could not bring herself to tell them the truth and remained silent. She believed that if she said nothing, the problem would eventually pass, though she now admitted that such thinking had been childish and naive. At that moment Karina stepped in. Karina claimed that she had been showing Aurora how to use the music box and had accidentally broken it herself before asking their parents for permission to comfort Aurora. Aurora recalled that after that incident, she refused to be separated from Karina. She followed her older sister everywhere, both at home and in public, always wanting to do everything together and becoming upset whenever she could not. She wanted dresses just like Karina's, or at least one of Karina's old dresses if that was not possible. Before long, she wanted anything and everything that belonged to Karina. Looking back, Aurora admitted that she had been a difficult little sister. Yet no matter how demanding she became, Karina never turned her away. Aurora described Karina as kind and wonderful. She had always been proud to call Karina her older sister and believed that no better person could be found anywhere in the world. Clenching her hand tightly, she wished they could have remained together forever if only it had been possible. Time passed, and they both grew older until Aurora received a marriage proposal. Eve reacted with surprise and confirmed whether Aurora had truly received one. Aurora affirmed that the proposal had come from Prince Orlando. She explained that Eve might already know that her family was not of particularly high standing among the nobility. Although they were nobles, their house belonged to the lowest rank, and under normal circumstances their lineage would never have been expected to receive a marriage proposal from the crown. However, these had not been ordinary circumstances. At first, Aurora had been excited by the proposal. Living so far from the center of the kingdom, her family possessed only modest wealth and relatively few assets. For the prince to send a proposal to the daughter of such a house had led Aurora to believe that he must have been kind-hearted, if somewhat eccentric, and that her life would not change very much after accepting. The reality, however, proved different. Aurora recalled asking her mother why she had to stay away from her sister. She pointed out that her mother and her aunts saw each other often and wondered why she could never see Karina again. Her mother explained that it was because of royalty, especially where the crown prince was concerned, and that things worked differently. She told Aurora that she had to abandon the life she had lived and begin anew as a member of the royal family. She also explained that Aurora could never return to the life she had once known. Aurora reflected that it had been naive of her to believe she and Karina could remain together after her marriage. Later, when she saw Karina leaving, she called out to her. She wondered whether Karina was going for a walk and wanted to accompany her. Karina noticed that Aurora had eaten very little at breakfast before she began coughing heavily. Karina urged Aurora to stay inside and rest, promising to bring back a present. She intended to pick some of the flowers Aurora liked so much or find something else to bring home for her. Aurora repeated to herself the words her mother had spoken about abandoning the life she had lived and beginning anew as a member of the royal family. Determined not to lose the opportunity, she insisted that she would be fine and pleaded with Karina to let her come along. She promised that she would not cause any trouble and would return home the moment she began feeling unwell. Karina agreed, and Aurora believed that perhaps this was her punishment for throwing a tantrum and troubling her sister. As they walked, the sky darkened. Thunder rumbled, and a sudden storm broke. Aurora began coughing heavily. Karina called her name, urged her to quickly put on her cloak, and told her they were almost home. Shortly afterward, Aurora lay breathless in bed, calling Karina's name. From outside the room, she heard their mother confronting Karina, demanding to know why she had taken Aurora on a walk when the younger girl had been weak since morning and questioning how she could have done something so foolish. She scolded Karina, insisting that, as the elder sister, she should have been more responsible. Aurora tried to say that it had been her own fault and that she needed to explain. Their mother replied that she assumed Aurora had insisted on accompanying Karina and complained about Aurora's stubbornness, especially on the eve of her engagement. She questioned why Aurora had gone at all, pointing out that she had been fully aware of her own condition and knew she had already gone beyond her limit. Karina apologized and claimed that she had been the one to suggest they go for a walk together, insisting that Aurora had done nothing wrong. Their mother reacted with surprise upon hearing this. Still weak and confused, Aurora wondered why Karina had not simply admitted that Aurora had thrown a tantrum. She tried to speak, but continuous coughing prevented her from saying anything. Aurora spent the following days confined to bed, drifting in and out of consciousness. By the time she finally awoke, she learned that Karina had been chosen to become engaged to the prince. She was told that others had judged her too frail and sickly for the life of royalty and that the decision had been made while she was unconscious. Aurora called for her mother and father. She insisted that everything had been her own fault, that she had forced Karina to take her along, and that her sister had done nothing wrong. She begged them to reconsider, but they replied that they still intended for Karina to marry His Highness. Aurora tried to protest, but her mother urged her to listen, explaining that she spoke only out of concern because the burden on Aurora's health would be too great. Aurora attempted to object again, but her father asked her to understand her mother's feelings and gently restrained her. He reassured her not to worry, saying that her older sister would manage perfectly well. Her mother then squeezed Aurora's hand and admitted that she felt relieved Aurora would not be moving to the royal palace. Looking back, Aurora said she could understand why Karina had felt compelled to say what she did. Faced with their parents' expectations, the pressure to make a decision, and her responsibilities as the older sister, Karina had accepted the burden. Aurora admitted that, at the time, she herself had done nothing and said nothing at all. Because she had wasted the time she had, Karina had been sent to the royal family. After finishing her story, Aurora apologized, admitting that she had become rather emotional. Eve assured her that it was all right. Aurora mentioned hearing Charlotte's earlier report before asking how the investigation into the Wolfkin was progressing. Eve admitted frankly that she had made very little progress. Aurora accepted this and remarked that, without an effective way to resolve the matter, they would have no choice but to rely on force, though she hoped to avoid such an outcome if possible. She also observed that the situation in the north would only deteriorate if they clashed with the Wolfkin, and she did not wish her sister's position to become even worse. Now that she knew Karina was still alive, Aurora no longer wanted to see her burdened. All she wished for was for her sister to walk her own path in life. Eve looked at Aurora and reflected that, if Aurora had never learned the truth back then, she might still have been happy in her own way. Even so, Eve believed Aurora did not regret learning the truth. Eve then explained that Wolfkin viewed everything through the lens of strength, and if humans resorted to force, force was exactly what they would receive in return. She stated that humans could never match the Wolfkin, and that not even an entire army could defeat them. Aurora asked how Eve could be so certain they would respond with force. Eve pressed a hand against her chest and revealed the reason. She explained that she herself was also a Wolfkin. Removing her hat, she revealed her wolf ears. She then urged Aurora to meet Karina in person, speak to her directly, and tell her how she truly felt. Chapter 15 began with Rishtoka trying on her wedding outfit. The maker asked what she thought of it before checking whether it was too tight anywhere and instructing her to raise her arms above her head. Rishtoka happily confirmed that it fit perfectly. She praised it as the finest and most skillfully made wedding attire they had ever crafted. The maker dismissed the compliment, remarking that flattery would not get her anywhere. When the other Wolfkin saw Rishtoka, they showered her with compliments. She felt somewhat embarrassed by the attention, but they continued remarking on how beautiful she looked and how well the attire suited her. Rishtoka commented that there were too many people watching when the marriage rite would not take place until the next full moon, and she worried that appearing before everyone now would lessen the impression on the actual day. The Wolfkin told her not to worry about it and remarked that it was still hard to believe the day had finally come for her to wear such clothing. Someone admitted they had never expected anyone to choose Rishtoka as a partner and wondered whether anyone else had thought the same. Another Wolfkin congratulated Rishtoka once again, saying they had believed she would remain alone for the rest of her life, and wished her a blessed future. The others laughed and joined in offering their congratulations, admitting they had also never imagined she would find someone. Rishtoka snapped at them over their remarks. The Wolfkin then instructed Rishtoka to remove the clothes so they would not become dirty before the marriage rite. They mentioned that only a few adjustments remained to be made to Lady Karina's outfit. Another Wolfkin asked whether Karina was still staying inside the house. Rishtoka responded only with a quiet hum. They remarked that they had not seen Karina for several days and wondered whether she was all right. Rishtoka asked what they meant. They explained that they had first assumed they were worrying unnecessarily, but Karina had been acting unlike herself ever since Rishtoka returned from the capital. One Wolfkin observed that Karina had not been eating much and asked whether something had happened during their trip to the capital. They questioned whether Karina's wish had truly been fulfilled, reasoning that if it had, she should have been there with them, happily sharing in the occasion. Afterward, Rishtoka returned home and went to see Karina. Karina lay in bed as Rishtoka softly called her name. Without saying a word, Karina glared at her from beneath the covers. Rishtoka remarked that Karina looked very unwell and asked how she was feeling and whether she had managed to get any sleep. She asked whether Karina could visit Rish's place the following day to have her wedding clothes adjusted, but only if she felt well enough to move about. She added that, if it was too much for her, they could always do it another day. Rishtoka moved closer and asked what was wrong. She explained that everyone was worried because Karina had shut herself away ever since they had returned to the village. She added that Karina had already achieved the revenge she wanted, so she could not understand why she was behaving this way. Rishtoka admitted that seeing Karina like this saddened her as well and pleaded for her to smile again as she always had before. Karina let out a hollow laugh and wondered whether smiling would make her seem more like a princess. Rishtoka blinked in confusion and quietly called Karina's name, unable to understand the sudden change in her attitude. Karina clenched her jaw and turned away, explaining that she simply could not shake off the fatigue from their journey and asking Rishtoka to leave her alone for a while. Rishtoka softly called Karina's name again, but Karina did not look back. Rishtoka went outside. Another Wolfkin asked what was wrong, remarking that it was unlike her to pass up hunting when the weather was good. Rishtoka quietly admitted that she simply did not feel like it that day. The wolfkin questioned what had caused the change, pointing out that Rishitoka was always hunting or going on adventures whenever she had even the slightest bit of free time. He remarked that her gloomy expression was getting in the way of their work, though he added that he did not mind whatever she chose to do. Rishitoka complained that he was being mean and asked whether she could not have a single day where she did nothing at all. The wolfkin replied that he had merely been thinking and that he had already planned to go hunting at noon before Rishitoka started bothering her. She then guessed that Rishitoka was thinking about Lady Karina, observing that everyone had been talking about her and that Rishitoka's feelings toward her were especially intense. Rishitoka admitted she was right but complained that she was making fun of her even though he already knew what was troubling her. Rishitoka fell silent, her expression troubled. She muttered that humans were complicated and dealing with them was such a hassle. She explained that she had believed Karina's sadness would disappear once she achieved the revenge she sought and that she would devote herself entirely to Rishitoka. Instead, the opposite had happened. Ever since they returned home, Karina had only become more despondent, and Rishitoka no longer knew what to do. The other wolfkin remarked that it was certainly strange and admitted that, even after living for a very long time, she still did not understand humans. She explained that wolfkin lived differently. They generally liked and wanted the same things, so as long as those desires were fulfilled, they were usually content. They grew closer to friends, lovers, and family by expressing their affection as often and as intensely as possible. From everything he had observed, however, humans were not like that. Rishitoka insisted that she had already tried everything she could think of to make Karina happy. She had given Karina a house, books, and many other things, doing everything she could imagine to bring her happiness. She admitted that she had never felt so anxious or uncertain about anything before. Seeing Karina suffer left her feeling helpless and deeply restless. All she wanted was to see Karina smile with genuine happiness. Rishitoka reflected that she had believed Karina would smile more happily than ever once her greatest wish, revenge, had been fulfilled. She wondered whether Karina's true wish was instead to become the happiest person in the world. She recalled believing that was the reason for their date, yet now she questioned whether revenge had ever truly been Karina's wish, even after she had trampled over the marriage right of her sister and that abominable prince and seemingly settled all of her resentments. Rishitoka remembered Karina swearing revenge against everyone present and declaring that she would obtain happiness for herself. She then quietly murmured her sister's name. A realization struck her as she wondered whether Karina's true wish had never been fulfilled. Believing she had finally found the answer, Rishitoka decided that she now knew how to make Karina happy. She resolved to leave everything to herself and vowed to complete Karina's revenge in her place. She berated herself for not realizing it sooner and wondered how she had become so complacent. To her, merely interrupting the marriage rite had been only half-hearted revenge. She believed Karina was too kind to realize that, as long as those who had earned her vengeance remained alive, their continued existence would keep Karina imprisoned from happiness. Rishitoka quietly affirmed her love for Karina and vowed to wash away all of Karina's sorrows. She resolved to bless her bride with Aurora's dead body.